You should be all set, Tom.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Tom Dolan. I'm the chair of the Londonderry PFAS Task Force. And I want to welcome tonight from the state, DES, which is going to give a very good informational session about what we're facing and what we will see in the near future. We're going to conduct this session virtually, and it will be televised at a later time. But you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the appropriate time. Listen to the presenters, and they'll tell you when it's the appropriate time for questions. I want to give you a coming attraction that the task force will be hosting in the Londonderry High School cafeteria. Vendors in a workshop for testing and mitigation issues. That'll be in June. And we very much look forward to that, and hopefully you'll come and get some close-up hands-on experience. At this point, I'd like to turn the briefing over to DES and Erin Holmes. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Erin Holmes, and I'm the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund Administrator at the Department of Environmental Services. And I'm serving as the primary contact on this issue between DES and the town. Before we get started, of course, I'd like to thank Tom Dolan and the rest of the PFAS task force, the town select board, and other members of the town administration for inviting us and hosting us tonight to communicate with the residents of Londonderry on the subject of PFAS. Tonight, we have an extremely knowledgeable and experienced panel that are here to hopefully answer most of the questions you have regarding PFAS in your community. There are over 300 residents registered for tonight's informational session, and we see this as extremely positive in the sense that the information we're providing will reach many of you, as well as you'll be able to share this information with your friends and neighbors, the links that we provide, and the information that you've learned. So thank you for taking the time tonight to join us. Before we get started, we've just got a little bit of housekeeping items. Just so you know, this meeting is being recorded, and that does include recording of anything you put in the question box. All attendees are muted upon entry, and you have no camera contact with us. If you are having technical difficulties, you may email Mary Buteau, and that's mary.buteau@des.nh.gov. Again, Mary, mary.butow@des.nh.gov, or you may call her on the phone at 603-271-8693. There are handouts that are included in the dashboard. If you want to access the dashboard, you might see a little orange block with a white arrow. If you click that, it'll open up the dashboard and you'll see a grade menu for handouts. All of the handouts and the presentation and the recording will be available in a Dropbox shortly after tonight, so you can access this at any time. Questions will be entertained at the end of the presentation, and unfortunately for those call-in participants only who are not on the computer, you have no method of communicating with us. You are truly call-in only and observing this meeting. However, again, there is plenty of resources. The town will be sharing all of this information, so you will always be able to find the contacts and reach out to DES directly. You'll also hear many of the names that of the people working on this and working with the town, so you'll be able to reach out to us as well. And then finally, the question function is not live right now, so if you're looking for it, don't worry, it will be live at the end of this event when we start the Q&A session. And Amy Russo will be providing more in-depth details at that time of how the Q&A session will work. Obviously, with 300 residents, we imagine there's going to be a lot of questions, and we'll be working through every one of you in the order that we receive it in the queue. So just be prepared, and you can ask your questions at the end. So I'd like to bring on the team that's here tonight to present this information to you. So if the panel would like to turn on their cameras. Hi, Amy. All right, and I think that's everybody. So tonight's agenda, we're looking to to present to you for about 90 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be focused on that Q&A session. I look at tonight's agenda really in two parts. The first 1 through 4 is, the first half of the meeting items on the agenda, numbers 1 through 4, are really focused on providing you a lot of information on PFAS, the history of it in southern New Hampshire, the sampling and occurrence, the health effects, and really providing you this overview and comprehensive picture of PFAS in the area. And then we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll move into the second part of the agenda, which is going to focus on really starting to think and talk about solutions. What are the funding programs out there? And then what are some of the town initiatives? So that's how we've set up the presentation tonight, and then that'll all be followed by the Q&A session. There will be another 5-minute break before the Q&A session as well. So first, I'd like to introduce Director Mike Wimsatt. He's the Director of Waste Management Division. He's been involved with the PFAS and PFAS response since 2015, maybe, Mike? And he'll be able to give you the information about the discovery and DES's approach. Then we have Dr. Jonathan Ali, who is the primary risk evaluator and assessor for the health effects of PFAS and was pinnacle in the development of the standards that we have. Then we have Jeff Martz, who's a hydrogeologist with the Haz Waste Remediation Bureau. He's going to provide an overview of the sampling, the occurrence of PFAS in the area. He's going to walk you through a tutorial of the notification letters and laboratory results so that you really understand the information that is being provided to you. Jeff also is the primary contact for all St. Gobain related issues and sampling results and initiatives through that. Then we have Brandon Kernan. He's the administrator of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau, and he's going to be talking about the occurrence of PFAS in public water systems in Londonderry, as well as he'll be talking about some of the options for alternative water and treatment options for those with private residents affected by PFAS. I will be giving an overview of the relevant funding programs and how they apply to different communities and water systems within the town of Londonderry. And Lisa Drabeck from the town of Londonderry, the assistant town manager, will be providing some oversight and about the initiatives that the town is working on as well. So thank you to the team. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Mike Wimsatt, and give me 1 second to hand him control. There we go.
Looks like I've got it, Aaron. Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for coming and spending some time with us tonight. And many thanks to the town of Londonderry for hosting this and asking us to come here to meet with you all. Obviously, one of the most important things we want to do tonight is to get to your questions and answer your questions. But it's important that we also give you a pretty, the presentation that Aaron has just described, which is, probably going to run 90 minutes or a little more, but it's a lot of really useful information that we think is going to really help give everybody put everybody on a level playing field in terms of understanding what these issues are. So before we get into some of the details that are really more specific to Londonderry, my job tonight is really just to try to bring everybody up to a common level of understanding on what PFAS are, how PFAS came to contaminate significant areas of southern New Hampshire, the St. Gobain's role and responsibilities in addressing that contamination. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of just let you know what PFAS are and talk about those things, and then we'll move on to other speakers who are going to get into more specific details. So essentially PFAS, I think a lot of people know this, but you never know. Someone could be entering this for the first time and haven't really heard about it before. So PFAS are synthetic organic compounds. They do not occur in nature. They're man-made entirely. And it's basically long carbon chains that contain multiple fluorine atoms. And the two PFAS that are the most studied are PFOA, which is the primary contaminant in southern New Hampshire. That stands for perfluorooctanoic acid. And the second one is perfluorooctane sulfonate, or PFOS. And PFOA was a major component of emulsions that were used at the St. Gobain facility to coat fabric with Teflon product. And PFOS is more commonly used, and it's best known for its use in firefighting foams that were used to fight flammable liquid fires. Now, PFAS as a family is a really large family of compounds. There are thousands of compounds in the family, but what they all have in common is that they're carbon chains that have fluorine atoms attached to them. So you've probably heard a lot of nomenclature about this that may be confusing. So we sort of have this PFAS family tree, if you will, that helps to explain it. When we first started working on this back in 2016, when the contamination was first discovered in southern New Hampshire, we were using the term perfluorinated chemicals or perfluorochemicals, and that's PFC, and that's this sort of apple that's fallen from the tree here. It's not an incorrect term, it's just not as inclusive as PFAS. PFOA and PFOS are both in the family of PFCs, but because we started looking at other compounds that we might be concerned about, it's now more common nationally to refer to the family as PFAS. So of those perfluoroalkyls, you can see on the family tree here, PFOS and PFOA are on there. We also have two other compounds that we'll talk about that we've set standards for, and that's PFHXS and PFNA. So PFAS were first developed in the late 1940s, and they have a very unique property that very few compounds have. And that is that they're all at the same time can repel water, but also repel oils and grease. And that's a pretty unusual property for one molecule to have. And as a result, they have just a tremendous variety of uses in so many both industrial, commercial, and consumer products. And so, as you can see, if you look through this list, many of the things on this list are things that we may come into contact with every day. The thing that we're going to focus on here this evening, if you look on the right side under industrial uses, it says textiles, upholstery, apparel, and carpets. And in fact, the work at St. Gobain was really textile work. It was coating textiles. And Jeff Martz is going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. But that's really what has resulted in the contamination of drinking water through a large area of southern New Hampshire. So let's talk about just how it was discovered. So in 2016, St. Gobain, which operates a facility in Merrimack, reported results of water tests at that facility. The reason that they took the water test is that they own other facilities in New York State and in Vermont that where they had already very recently detected PFOA contamination in groundwater and drinking water. So knowing that they were operating the same kind of manufacturing operations in New Hampshire, they took a test of the water. And actually the water coming into the facility that they tested was actually from a public water system, Merrimack Village District system, from wells that are located in Merrimack. And that water tested at 30 parts per trillion for PFOA. So they notified DES of that in the water system, and we immediately began taking really extraordinary steps to sample public and private drinking water supplies in the vicinity of the plant. And as we did that work, it expanded very rapidly based on the results we were getting. We went across the Merrimack River in Litchfield, and we found widespread contamination in both overburden groundwater and deep bedrock wells there. So that really, for us, made it very clear quickly that we had an airborne transport pathway that was causing this. This was not a conventional release to the ground where the groundwater migrated and contaminated other wells. This was an airborne transport where the compounds were released to the air, deposited on the ground, and then over a wide area, and then impacted groundwater. So that meant that our testing had to expand really rapidly, and we found amongst other communities that there were significant impacts to drinking water wells in Londonderry. So the components of our incident response were really just this, unlike anything DES had ever done before, a massive outreach and sampling effort. We were sampling both public and private water supplies. We sent out all hands on deck DES sampling teams to knock on doors. We used GIS and postal mailings and phone and door-to-door knocking to try to get notify as many people as possible and get a sample of their well water. And so as we learned that we had a significant expansive problem, the short-term solution was to try to get bottled water to people as quickly as possible. And then we knew that a long-term solution was going to include providing some kind of clean alternate water source, which would likely be, and has turned out to be, expansion of drinking water, public drinking water systems throughout many, many communities. So that was the ultimate response that we designed at the time, and we'll talk about the standards. We really didn't have any waterline extensions that were designed for Londonderry because most of the effects we saw were below the level that we were looking at the time, which was 70 parts per trillion. But as you know, we lowered that standard, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And there is now extensive sampling going on, and has been for some time in Londonderry, and alternate water planning that is moving forward. So let's talk about the standards. So right after discovery in March of 2016, we knew that EPA had been working to look at PFOA. They had a provisional health advisory for it, but they were looking to develop what they would call a lifetime health advisory. And we were aware that that had not been completed yet, but they were very close to doing that. So we really emphasized and implored EPA to accelerate that work and get that done as quickly as possible. They did that. And then in April, they issued a lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, either separate or in combined concentration. So we undertook immediate emergency rulemaking in April of 16 to establish that as an ambient groundwater quality standard, which is a standard that's enforceable that we use to address impacts from sites that contaminate groundwater. So as time marched on, there was a tremendous amount of work going on to study the toxicology of these compounds. And by September 30th of 2019, we implemented a rulemaking that established lower standards for these compounds. Unfortunately, that was immediately met with a lawsuit that sought a preliminary injunction to prevent us from enforcing the standard. So as that happened, even though we had a rule in place, by December of 31st of that year, we could no longer enforce those lower standards. Now, by July of 2020, the legislature acted to basically bypass that, and as a matter of law, a bill was signed by the governor in July of 2020 that established those standards. And those lower standards are as follows here. So for PFOA, remember we were at 70 parts per trillion. The standard was lowered to 12 parts per trillion, a much lower standard. PFOS 15 and the other two compounds, which we really don't see in evidence in groundwater in southern New Hampshire, but those have also been implemented. So the MCL's little nomenclature, a maximum contaminant level is an enforceable standard for drinking water in a public water supply well. Ambient groundwater quality standards, as I mentioned earlier, is a standard that we can enforce when a party has caused contamination of drinking water wells, not just public water supplies, but including private drinking water wells. So the next thing I want to talk about, and then I'll finish up and hand it off to the next speaker, is St. Gobain's responsibilities with respect to this. So I'm going to talk about a consent decree that we negotiated with St. Gobain in 2018. And the reason we negotiated that consent decree is we really knew that we had extensive areas that needed an extension of public drinking water. We needed St. Gobain to act on that promptly, get that design work going and get that construction done. And it was necessary to negotiate a consent decree to accomplish that in a prompt fashion. So as you're going to see here on the next slide, I'm going to describe what these are, but there's a red line on the inside here. The facility is right in the center of that. That's what we call a pre-GMZ. And a GMZ is a acronym that stands for Groundwater Management Zone. And that is a zone, that's a term in our site cleanup program that we use to describe the area of a site that is impacted, where groundwater is impacted above the ambient groundwater quality standard. And so in this case, we called it a pre-GMZ because we knew we weren't done with our sampling yet, but we were pretty sure at that point that most of the groundwater within that red line was above 70 parts per trillion. And so we established that as like a pre-GMZ, realizing that it would expand in the future based on additional sampling. And then the blue line here is what we call the outer boundary of the consent decree. And I'm going to go to the next slide here to explain what that means. So the blue line, the outer boundary, basically limited St. Gobain's responsibilities for testing and addressing impacts to impacts that were over 70 parts per trillion. And keep in mind, in 2018, when we negotiated this agreement, that was the standard that we were enforcing. Now, in the area between the red and the blue line, so if you want to call it the donut, it's an oddly shaped donut, but the area between the red and the blue line, that outer boundary area, the state, per the terms of the consent decree, retained all of its original authorities, which meant that it could ask St. Gobain to do further investigations there. And to the extent that impacts were found above any standard that we set, not just 70, we would be able to require them to address and provide alternate water. So it's important to understand that there are significant impacts to drinking water in Londonderry, and those impacts happen both inside and outside the CD outer boundary. So I wanted to prepare a slide that we kind of just in plain language explain what that means. So clearly where you're located relative to those consent decree boundaries makes a difference on whether or not St. Gobain is going to be responsible to provide assistance to you. Now, inside the outer boundary, as I said, we expect St. Gobain to investigate drinking water impacts and to address those impacts that are attributed, at least in part, to their emissions. Outside the outer boundary, DES requires St. Gobain to sample, and St. Gobain is responsible for PFOA or PFOS impacts to drinking water wells that are over 70 parts per trillion, but not lower. So that means that outside the outer boundary, DES and the town are working together DES has taken lead on investigating the impacts outside the outer boundary and sampling. And so you've seen DES sampling teams doing that sampling. And then we're working with the town to develop solutions for impacts in that area. So you're going to hear a lot more about this, and we're going to have an opportunity to entertain questions about it. But at this point, I want to conclude my talk, and I want to turn it over to Dr. John Alley, who is going to speak to you about health effects. And Aaron, I think I've lost control of the slides, so I'm not going to be able to advance.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Let me see if I have control. Trying again. Okay, there we go. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Alley. I'm the toxicologist with the Department of Environmental Services. And this portion of the presentation is going to go over how you can be exposed to PFAS and why that can be a concern, and where in some situations it's not as concerning, but also what some of the health effects are, maybe health concerns the residents might have. Let's see if this advances. Okay. So within my role at the agency for DES, I also work with the Department of Health and Human Services. So if there are questions tonight that I can't answer that's more appropriate for them, I'll try to go to them and get answers for you. But our program also works with federal partners, and this includes the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. They have a special grant program called Apple Tree that provides support to local state efforts. And that's not to be mistaken with Apple Tree Mall, because we've had that mistake happen a couple of times in the area. So the health portion of this is covered by a lot of different partners working within the state and across several states and the region. So if anyone has questions, I'm happy to connect you back to those partners. So one of the first questions we want to start with is, how are you exposed to PFAS? So we only are concerned about chemicals when they go from your environment into your body. The primary way that PFAS do this, especially the ones that we are regulating, is through consumption or ingestion of water or contaminated food. This is one of the reasons that we set a drinking water standard for these, is because when they get into your digestive system, they can be fairly well absorbed into your bloodstream and then move around in your body. We also know that most PFAS can transfer across the placenta and into fetuses. So if they are in the body of mothers, they are transferred to the fetuses before they are born, and they can also be transferred into breast milk. And in fact, we do have studies that would show that for several decades, apparently this has been going on. So most people on Earth are born with some level of PFAS in their body. As Mike mentioned before, these chemicals are used in a lot of different areas of commerce. So people have had some level of exposure. But when they're in a place like drinking water, this can lead to heightened exposure because they're dissolved into the water and then they more readily are absorbed by the digestive system. There may be some concern for exposure to PFAS through inhalation or the accidental ingestion of dust. So a lot of those household products that people use that used to contain PFAS, as they wear and tear throughout the years, can produce dust particles that can either be inhaled and settle into the body, absorbed that way, or for small infants or children who tend to crawl around on their hands and feet and then may put their hands onto toys, put those in their mouth, or put their hands into their mouth. That could be another source of exposure. There is some concern that certain PFAS may be absorbed across the skin, but for the ones that are currently being regulated, we call these long-chain PFAS. And the current data suggests that they're not very well absorbed across the skin when compared to how well they're absorbed through ingestion. So our standards are really meant for protecting from ingestion, and they may be overly protective relative to concerns from skin contact or exposure that way. But the biggest concern that we have about exposure to PFAS is they're highly bioaccumulative. Certain PFAS, such as the long chains that we are regulating, have the ability to go into the body and stay in there for a long time. The human body seems to reabsorb these compounds from the kidneys, not letting them leave when we urinate, so they can build up over time. And that's one of the reasons that we're regulating these at a nanogram per liter or parts per trillion. That's a very low level to measure in the environment, but because of the way that these build up, that's why we set standards at this range. So as Mike previously mentioned, we have 4 individual standards for these different compounds, and this is based on selecting protective standards for the most sensitive effects that there was evidence for at the time. One of the things that's important to recognize is these numbers are meant for the most sensitive segment of the population. In our request from the legislature to develop these protective standards, we were asked to consider the most sensitive life stages when developing these numbers. Because of the way that these chemicals can accumulate in the body over time and transfer into fetuses and to infants through breast milk, we developed these standards to protect pregnant and lactating women, their infants, or women who plan on becoming pregnant. This is also for those same individuals who consume a very high amount of water on a regular basis, regularly at home or wherever they're getting their water from. And then also those same individuals that are exposed for a long period of time or chronic exposure. So we even reduce this a little bit more because we recognize that PFAS are unique and that people still have some exposure from other sources in their environment. You could be getting it from seafood items, you could be getting it from the wear and tear of household products before these chemicals are phased out. And there's other places that we believe people may have exposure from. So these standards try to account for that. So that's why these standards are as low as they are. And accounting for this in the way that we did using more recent data, that's one of the main reasons that our standards are lower than the EPA's. In 2016, when they initially set a guidance value of 70 nanograms per liter, that was based on available data at that time. The science has changed and evolved, and if you want to follow this link, you can find out more information about that, see what studies we used and how we arrived at these numbers to be protective for the most sensitive segments of the population. So what are some of the health risks from a chronic exposure to PFAS? There's been several studies over the last 2 decades or so that have tried to identify what happens if people are exposed to PFAS for a long time. In some of these cases, there's studies in communities where people have been exposed through drinking water, and other ones have looked at occupational exposures. So people that actually work with these chemicals either in industry or sometimes in the case of firefighters who are exposed through firefighting foams. Some of the main health effects that seem to consistently show up when we look across several studies is an increased risk for higher cholesterol levels, changes in liver enzyme levels that reflect changes in liver function, subtle or small changes in an infant's birth weight, alterations in immune system function, increased hypertension risk or preeclampsia for pregnant women, There may be some changes with thyroid hormone concentrations and possibly other hormones like testosterone and estrogen. And finally, in some studies in communities that have much higher exposures than what we're seeing in certain parts of New Hampshire, there has been one study that identified potential increased risk for kidney and testicular cancer, but this is still a debated area of science. So a lot of these studies, these observations, I should say, are the result of dozens to hundreds of studies coming together, and they've been reviewed by different agencies and groups. The science is rapidly evolving on this area. PFAS has been a very hot topic of research. So if you go Google PFAS and health effects, you will find all kinds of things that will come up. Some studies are better than others. Some studies are well designed to observe an effect, and other ones not so much. Because of how long these chemicals stay in the body, it's very easy to detect them across the United States and across the world in people's blood. We are constantly trying to keep up with this change of information, and so are our partners at the CDC and at other state agencies. If you want any more information on what is currently being done at the federal level, I've provided a link here to take you to the ATSDR, or Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. They have some helpful fact sheets, and they also have some updates on some of the national work that they're doing to actually study and identify what's going on with these chemicals. So the last part of my presentation is going to go over some common questions that I've been getting from residents in Londonderry and other parts of New Hampshire. So one of the first questions that I get is, where can my physician learn about PFAS and my family's health risk? So if you've been drinking the water, you're concerned about exposure and a certain health risk related to that, the first place you should start with that is having a discussion with your physician. So you want to make sure that you're not missing anything else that could be causing your health effects, but you also want to make sure that they're aware that something is going on that's concerning to you. Both the state New Hampshire Department, or the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as ATSDR, have provided helpful information for physicians in identifying these issues. This is still an area that needs improved work though. So right now there is a national panel that is trying to develop more definitive guidance for physicians to understand what's going on with PFAS. This topic is very new. So if you go talk to your physician, they may be learning it alongside you. So have some patience with them, but they can either call me or they can call our partners at the state or at the CDC, and we'll get them information that they can use to help you. A second common question is there a way to test how much PFAS is in my blood? The answer is yes, but it's complicated. The same legislation that allowed for our MCLs to go into effect also required insurance companies to pay for PFAS blood testing. So a physician can order a PFAS blood test, but at this time, there's very few labs that are capable of doing this. So it may be difficult at first for your physician to find that kind of lab. But secondly, there's no definitive guidance to interpret those results. So oftentimes you're getting a number back, you'll know what amount of PFAS is in your blood, but there's nothing really that a physician can do to act on that or prescribe treatment or change your course of care. So it's a very personal choice. If you're wanting to pursue that, you should really speak with your physician to make sure that it's right for you and their course of care. And some physicians may not be comfortable with that sort of testing. It all depends on their practice. So that is to say, yes, there is testing, but it's a very complex issue. Another question that we get is, can I cook with the water? So we're telling you that this is a drinking water standard. Maybe you can cook? No. If you're above the drinking water standard, we do not recommend that you cook with that water. So boiling the water will not remove PFAS compounds from it. In fact, it could concentrate the compounds by removing the water and leaving these behind. Additionally, PFAS like to stick to things like protein. So most foods have some level of protein in them. So if you actually cook with the water, it may concentrate this into the food items, and by ingestion, increase your overall exposure. Another question is, can you use the water for bathing, showering, and cleaning? As I mentioned before, the 4 compounds that we're regulating for don't appear to be very well absorbed through the skin. In other sites where EPA does investigations of PFOA, which is the primary contaminant in your area, they usually set screening values between 100 to 1,000 times higher than what we detect in most homes in your area. So we don't really see a huge risk from dermal absorption. So that's not really a key way that these chemicals get into the body. So things like bathing and showering are relatively low risk activities, but for some individuals that have specific concerns, feel free to call us, we can talk through that. There are in some cases where studies have shown PFAS can be absorbed, but this is again at much, much higher concentrations than what we usually see in typical residential well contamination situations. And as far as cleaning, if you're using it for washing dishes or other products, again, PFAS are also used in certain household products. So there may already be some level of those present, but you're not having as much interaction through that residue versus if you're actually ingesting the water on a regular basis. Another common question, especially given this time of year, is can I irrigate vegetables or fruit in my garden with this water? And at this time, our guidance is meant for drinking water, and we do not have guidance for use of irrigation. The interaction between PFAS and plants is very complex and very poorly understood at this time. It appears some plants can take up PFAS and retain them. Other plants don't seem to do it at all. It gets more complicated because it depends on the soil that you're using. And at this time, we don't have enough data to make a definitive conclusion on what's the safe level or not, depending on how someone's growing things. There are studies and some information that has been generated on this, and I'm happy to share that with anyone that has additional questions or wants to talk through some of their concerns. Similarly, we get questions about, can I use the water to irrigate my lawn? Again, our standards are meant for drinking, not for risk from contact or dermal absorption. So if you're watering your lawn, some people have questions about if there's residue left behind from that. Is there a risk if I come in contact with it, or my children or my pets? And what's the risk to them by coming in contact with that? Relatively low risk activities like that, it's again that issue of these aren't really well absorbed across the skin. But we also like to remind people that if you're having those kind of interactions, if you're out on the lawn, if you're using any other lawn care products that may contain pesticides or other chemical irritants, just be mindful of those too, because those might present greater risk sometimes. We do have soil standards that can be used for certain investigations, and we can talk with people about those, or if there's certain areas that want to do a little bit more work, such as the town, we're happy to work with them on that. Another common question, should I be concerned about my pets? I'm a dog owner. I always worry about what my dog gets into. Folks usually have this question because they're thinking, should I be switching my dog to an alternative source of water or not? Your first thing you should do is, if you have a health concern for your pet, talk with your veterinarian. They may already have existing health issues, that's your pet I mean, and if that's the case, you want to make sure that that's being addressed first thing, and whatever the cause of that might be. With PFAS, we don't have a lot of information to understand what the risks are to canines, cats, common aquaria animals like fish, but it does appear that from the limited information we do have, they don't seem to retain these chemicals as well in their body as humans do. So again, we're regulating at a low parts per trillion level because humans have a unique ability to accumulate these. Also, for dogs and cats, they tend to get into a lot of other things. If you have household products that have PFAS or PFAS residues on them, if your pets are laying on those, interacting with them, and then grooming themselves, they may be getting a higher amount of exposure from those sources relative to water. And then finally, as Mike mentioned, that PFAS are a general class of chemicals, and we have standards for 4 of these. That's because at this time, there's sufficient data for us to develop robust standards for those 4 that we believe are reliable and protective for our residents. We're continuing to monitor the data that comes out on other PFAS compounds to understand what the risks are for those. If you're getting results back and you're seeing that other PFAS are present, we're happy to talk through those results with you and see what resources we can find to help you understand what that means. But again, at this time, we are running into the challenge where PFAS is very complicated and evolving area of science. So sometimes we may not have an answer because the work hasn't been done yet. So I quickly wanted to promote another program that we have through DES and through our partners at DHHS. It's this Apple Tree program. It's actually designed to help out in community situations like this. So your community is fairly new to this. If you're needing more information or resources to understand what the contamination is, health risk, or possibly doing some education outreach, we can work with you on that. And also if you have questions about historical sites around your area that may also be contributing to PFAS contamination, we can act as a liaison to help you get more information about that, either from state agencies or from our partners at the EPA. Karen Craver is the key contact for that. She's our current principal investigator for it. So you can either contact her directly, or if you want to reach out to me, I'll put you in contact with Karen. And with that, there's my contact information. I'll be taking questions at the end of this, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Jeff Martz.
Thank you, John, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeff Martz. I'm a senior hydrogeologist with New Hampshire DES's Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau. The Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau is the bureau at DES that's tasked with providing regulatory oversight for the investigation and remediation of PFAS contaminated sites. So I'll be talking about PFAS sites in and around Londonderry, drinking water sampling, and PFAS occurrence. So I want to talk about two different types of sources of PFAS in the town of Londonderry. Mike already mentioned St. Gobain, but I also want to bring up what we refer to as discrete PFAS sites. And these can be sites that include the Manchester Airport, where AFFF may have been releasing PFAS to the ground, as well as tanker spills where foam has been applied, places such as landfills or other industrial facilities where PFAS has been released to the ground, and the extent of contamination is relatively minor compared to the regional contamination that we're talking about in the context of the air release from St. Gobain. So just to reiterate what Mike mentioned about the outer consent decree boundary, I've shown that on this figure in blue. And of course, Londonderry is outlined in yellow, and I've blued out the other towns just to highlight Londonderry. So the outer consent decree boundary generally follows High Range Road. So properties to the west of High Range Road are within that outer consent decree boundary, and properties to the east of High Range Road are outside the consent decree boundary. I'll just illustrate the pre-GMZ that was talked about, where waterline extensions occurred and most of the well testing that exceeded 70 parts per trillion was contained within, and that pre-GMZ boundary goes up to the western boundary of Londonderry, generally following Litchfield and Manchester. Just want to point out the St. Gobain site is located here in Merrimack, if you can see my cursor. So it's on the west side of the Merrimack River. Just going to walk through a handful of the other discrete sites. So we have the Manchester Airport. The Auburn Road landfill is a federally managed site. And then I'll just point out the Apple Tree and Tinkham's Garage or some other sites in southeastern Londonderry. Going to point out we have Amy Doherty here. She is our state site supervisor in the Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau, and she'll be able to assist with questions for residents that are living outside the consent decree. Just within our bureau, we've divided up responsibility between inside the consent decree with the St. Gobain site that I manage, and Amy is handling stuff outside the consent decree. Also, we have individual project managers assigned to each of these or many of these individual discrete PFAS sites. I manage the Manchester Airport and recently took over management of the Apple Tree Mall. So, you know, between Amy and I, we can certainly address your questions or get you to the most knowledgeable project manager. So in terms of St. Gobain, we're talking about Londonderry because of the air release pathway. And as Mike mentioned, this St. Gobain facility coats textiles with PFAS containing emulsions. And the textiles are on big rolls and they're dipped through pans containing these emulsions. And then the wet fabric goes up into ovens that are generally vertically oriented, where the fabric and the chemicals are heated. And the exhaust from that heating process goes out through a series of smokestacks located on the roof, and it's transported with the wind. And in the case of Londonderry, the wind transports it across the Merrimack River, across Litchfield, across Manchester into Londonderry, where it can be deposited on the ground as either wet precipitation falling with rain or snow, or dry deposition as little particles falling on the ground surface. With each subsequent rain event, the PFAS are washed into the soil, and they slowly work their way through the soil package to where they reach the groundwater table. And that groundwater table can be either in fractured rock, or it can be in soil overburden, and I'll talk about that a little more later on in my talk. But once it reaches the water table, these compounds are fairly mobile with groundwater, and they can be drawn into water supply wells. Before I move on to the next slide, I want to point out that Gobain is required to install air emission control equipment at their facility in Merrimack, and that is required to be in place and operational by July 30th, 2021 of this year. And we do have Kathy Beam will be available for questions at the end of the talk if anybody wants to know about the specifics of the air emissions and the air emission controls. So there are 5 primary sources of PFAS sampling data in the town of Londonderry. First, Gobain is responsible for investigating and evaluating the extent of ambient groundwater quality violations within the consent decree due to discharges from its Merrimack facility. With the lowering of the PFAS standards, Gobain submitted a work plan in September of 2019 to outline how they plan to identify wells that exceed ambient groundwater quality standards. And subsequently, 8 addenda have been submitted to DES. These are submitted approximately on a monthly basis. As new data comes in, it's evaluated. And I'll talk a little bit about their sampling approach on another slide. The 9th addenda is expected by the end of the month, so that'll be an additional list of properties for sampling. And Golder Associates, which is the environmental consultant hired by Gobain to do this work, they're licensed environmental consultants to conduct these types of investigations. They submit bi-weekly updates and bi-month reports to DES, and these are available for public viewing on our one-stop webpage. Another major source of PFAS data in Londonderry is the NHDES. As Mike mentioned, DES is sampling outside the consent decree area. And this has focused on private well testing request forms, which we sometimes refer to as SurveyMonkey. These are found on the DES website. That has driven some of the sampling, as well as notification program sampling. DES is required to notify properties within 500 feet of an AGQS exceedance, and currently sampling by DES is focused on areas within 500 feet and people that receive letters, and I'll talk about those letters also later on. Finally, I want to point out the town of Londonderry has had a groundwater sampling program going back several decades, where they've sampled a subset of wells across the town and had them analyzed for a variety of different compounds, both naturally occurring and man-made. And I believe it was in 2018, late 2018, 2019 timeframe, the town did another round of sampling and included PFAS and submitted those results to DES. So that was an initial new data set coming in as the standards were in the process of being lowered. And I also want to mention that a number of residents have also submitted results to DES, and just call out the importance of, if you self-sample your well and your results are above standard, it's very helpful to submit those results to DES so that we can follow up with notifications and further investigate those results. So each of the discrete release sites I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, the little pink stars, many of those have responsible parties that have been identified, and those responsible parties are tasked with investigating and continuing to monitor the quality of groundwater in and around their sites. So they're another source of PFAS data. And lastly, public water supplies are required to do some testing for PFAS. And Brandon Kernan is here tonight, and he'll talk about that in more detail later on. So here's a slide showing the data for PFOA. So these are groundwater samples that were analyzed for PFAS, and I'm showing the results for the compound PFOA. And as Mike mentioned, that is the primary driver of ambient groundwater quality standard exceedances for PFAS. So throughout the remainder of my talk, I'm going to refer primarily to PFOA on my slides. And I want to mention the color chart is consistent for each of my slides, although I do have a few excerpts that I've included from St. Gobain's consultant, and they have a different color scheme. But on my slides, I'm going to be showing any results that are less than half of the ambient groundwater quality standard of 12 in the range of 0 to 6 parts per trillion. Those are colored green. 6 to 9 are colored yellow. 9 to 12 are orange. And then anything that's over the new standard of 12 parts per trillion is colored red, with the exception of results that are over 70 parts per trillion, the previous standard. Those are colored purple. And if you look closely at the map of Londonderry, you can see that there are, with only a few minor exceptions, very few occurrences of groundwater results that are over 70 parts per trillion. There are a handful. I think in general, they're located next to discrete sites or proximal to discrete sites. But in general, we find very, very few results above 70 parts per trillion. But of the 1,340 wells that have been sampled, 383 of which are inside the consent decree, 957 are outside the consent decree. Of those 1,300 wells, approximately 620 exceed ambient groundwater quality standards for one or more PFAS. So again, the breakdown, 235 of those exceedances are inside the consent decree and 385 are outside the consent decree. I also want to point out on this figure, I've shown the extent of public water systems, just to give you a sense of which part of towns are served by public water. And it's important to note that there are pretty significant areas in Londonderry that are solely supplied by individual or small community water supply wells. So now I want to drill down into the consent decree and the sampling that St. Gobain is doing. So now we're going to that area that's west of High Range Road. And the map on the right-hand side of this slide is an overview of the entire St. Gobain consent decree area. And these figures are from one of Golder's bi-monthly reports, the most recent one. So they have a slightly different color scheme than what I mentioned before. But the entire 64 square mile area encompassing several towns is depicted in the right-hand image. And in the center, I've drilled down into the portion of the consent decree that's in Londonderry. And while this map is very busy, I want to just walk you through some of the key colors. So when St. Gobain's consultant identified properties that are confirmed to be connected to public water, they've colored those as green. And properties that are adjacent to public water lines, but they haven't yet confirmed the connection, are shown as blue. So generally in the northern half of the consent decree area, there's a lot of public water connections. Properties that are colored brown have been identified for sampling by St. Gobain and may or may not have been sampled. Sampling is voluntary, so it's contingent upon the residents providing permission to have a water sample collected from their well. So in essence, the brown properties have either been sampled or have been invited to be sampled. The pink colored parcels are parcels that have been tested, and the results show a violation of AGQS, primarily for PFOA, and those properties have been offered bottled water by St. Gobain. And also on this figure, there's some blue hatched patterns, particularly in the southern part and the central part of the consent decree area. And these are most recently identified properties. So each addenda identifies a new round of properties for sampling. And I'll drill into that in my next slide. So here's a blow up of one neighborhood and shows the different colors. And it also shows the different results for wells that have been sampled. In this color scheme, anything that's yellow is over standard, anything that's green is less than standard but detected, and samples where no PFAS were detected or no PFOA was detected are colored gray. And I often get the question, why was my property selected for sampling? The primary driver of sampling so far has been proximity to another ambient groundwater quality exceedance. And it's my understanding that in the forthcoming addenda, Gobain will be identifying properties within 500 feet of one of these exceedances and putting them on the next list to be sampled. Another criteria that Golder has begun to identify are neighborhood scale, where big blocks of lots have been identified for sampling. And finally, the third category is what I call quasi-random sampling in areas where there's low sample density. So for example, down here, we don't have a lot of PFAS data, and Gobain's consultant has identified 2 lots for sampling. So once a well is tested and the results are above standard, Gobain is required to provide alternate water, and in the interim, this is in the form of bottled water. So if your well is sampled, Gobain's consultant will send you a package that includes 1, your lab results, 2, a summary table of your lab results, and I have an example of that I can talk you through later on, and a cover letter from Golder Associates. And in the case of properties that have results above standard, there's a letter on Gobain letterhead offering bottled water. And I've highlighted in yellow on this slide a phone number for Monadnock Spring Water, who is the contractor that Gobain has retained to deliver bottled water. So next slide is going to walk you through the process. So we asked Gobain and Golder to provide a slide to clarify the process of obtaining bottled water. And basically, once a well tests above standard, the letters are sent to both the property owner and copies are sent to Monadnock Springs so they can anticipate calls from the residents. So if the property owner chooses to accept the offer for bottled water, they can contact Monadnock Springs to coordinate delivery, set up routine delivery dates and amounts of water needed. And Gobain asks that the property owner monitors the inventory of bottled water and notifies Monadnock Springs 2 to 3 weeks before additional water is needed. And they want to remind the property owner to make sure that all occupants within a property that's served by a contaminated well, this would include any tenants or any other people in the occupancy, are made aware of the bottled water offer and are made access to that water is made available. So one thing that we're finding when we look at the data coming in from Londonderry and the other towns affected by this aerial deposition is that there's a very complex pattern of PFAS in the groundwater. And when you drill down to the neighborhood level, we often find situations where one well will be above standard and the adjoining well just tens of feet away can be below standard or not with PFOA not detected at all. So there are several, I think, reasons that are driving this complex spatial distribution of PFAS in groundwater. And I'll just walk you through some of the main reasons of why we think this is occurring. And it starts with differences in aerial deposition. So in the upper right or upper left-hand side of this diagram, the yellow to purple colored contour map represents the amount of PFOA that has been modeled by DES to have been deposited as a result of emissions from the Gobain facility, with the yellow color indicating higher amounts of aerial deposition and the darker purple indicating lesser amounts of aerial deposition. So in general, the amount of PFAS deposited on the ground decrease with distance from the Gobain factory. But there are some nuances, in part due to topographic effects as well as, different predominant wind directions. The next factor that is important is the superficial geology. So as the glaciers retreated and advanced over New Hampshire thousands of years ago, they left behind different types of sediment. This could be glacial till, this could be sand and gravel deposits, it could be fine-grained lakebed deposits. And this is important from a PFAS standpoint in that certain PFAS have different tendencies to stick or sorb to different soil types. So the types of soil, the thicknesses of soil, and other soil properties are thought to influence the way PFAS move through the subsurface and into aquifers. And I'll talk about that in more detail on the next slide, along with the bedrock geologic factors that also strongly influence PFAS on a well-to-well basis. And before I move on, I want to talk about mention some time-related factors. Over time, the there have been changes to the chemical formulas that have been used at St. Gobain, and these formulas have changed over time. The amount of PFOA in these chemicals has decreased over time. Another time-related factor includes precursor transformation, where big molecules break down into smaller molecules that we regulate. And finally, I point out that seasonal variation it may play a role in certain circumstances with the complex distribution that we see in map view. So getting back to this, trying to answer this question of why do neighboring wells have different concentrations of PFOA? So to answer that question, I've put together this cross-section or profile view of 3 different wells and hypothetical wells. And what we're looking at is a slice through the ground surface. So if you can imagine looking down and seeing your well from the side. So this well, this diagram might be about 400 to 600 feet deep. Commonly bedrock wells go quite deep. And if we look at this, I'm using the same again, color coding that I've used for PFOA throughout the talk. So green is less than half of the AGQS, and anything over standard is red. So when you have wells that are close together, presumably the amount of air deposition is roughly the same for a small neighborhood. So in this case, in this example, I have aerial deposition resulting in shallow groundwater entering the soil column being above standard. And the well on the right is a shallow overburden well, often referred to as a dug well, a driven well, or a dry point. And this is a well that's screened in the soil, which I've represented on this figure as a tan stippled pattern. And in this case, there hasn't been a lot of time for the water to be in contact with the soil and have that PFAS sorb. So the shallow groundwater that's pumped from an overburden well, we often find that that water is over standard in many instances. Whereas you could have a bedrock well right next to it. So now moving to the middle example, a bedrock well is constructed by advancing casing through the soil to keep water from the soil and the soil from collapsing into the well. And then it's drilled down below that casing through solid rock until it encounters water-bearing fractures. And I've shown a picture here taken with a downhole well video camera of actual fractures and water emanating into a well from fractures to just give you an idea of what you might find if you were to look down inside your well and look at these fractures. So in the case of the middle well here, the water infiltrating through the soil column initially starts out above the standard for PFOA, so greater than 12, but as it moves through this thick soil column, some of the PFOA has sorbed to the soil so that by the time it reaches the bedrock and enters into the fractures, the concentration is dropped into the 9 to 12 range, and where it flows into the well through the first fracture that was intercepted by the drill rig. But in this example, the drill rig drilled deeper and hit a second fracture much deeper, and that fracture contains water that's less than half of the ambient groundwater quality standard. So when the well pump turns on, it draws water from both these fractures, the water mixes together, and the resulting concentration of PFOA in this example is between 6 and 9, so a little bit less than that upper fracture that the well first encountered. Finally, moving to the leftmost well, this well has relatively thin soil cover, so there's very little attenuation of PFOA or sorption that's going on as the water moves through the soil. So the shallow fracture that this well encountered has higher concentrations that are above the standard for PFOA. So this well is above standard. So we mentioned a little bit about the notification sampling. So by state statute, DES is required to notify property owners located within 500 feet of a well that has an ambient groundwater quality standard. And I've just shown some example letters here. We have different formats for inside the consent decree because we've tailored them to the circumstances of the consent decree in St. Gobain. And then we have another example letter for outside the consent decree. But the important takeaway is that each of these letters has specific instructions on who to contact if you wish to have your well sampled. And strongly recommend that you follow the recommendations on there as to who to contact. So now moving into some examples of laboratory reports and summary tables. In this case, this is a summary table, an example summary table from Golder Associates, who's doing the sampling for St. Gobain. And they've summarized the 20+ page lab report and condensed it down to a single table that is helpful to look at. And to try and break this down, I've highlighted in yellow the 4 compounds that DES regulates. So that's PFOA, PFNA, PFHXS, and PFOS. And the way to read this is to find the acronym in the analyte acronym column, and then move your finger across to the ambient groundwater quality standard column, which I've circled in blue. So these are the DES standards. So in the case of PFOA, the standard is 12. And then the result, or the amount of the compound that was detected in your water sample, is shown under the result column. So in this example, 66 nanograms per liter, NG per L is a shorthand for nanograms per liter, and nanograms per liter are approximately equivalent to parts per trillion, so they're used interchangeably when talking about residential well water quality. So in this case, 66 is greater than 12, so this is an ambient groundwater quality standard violation for PFOA. In the case of PFNA, you have a number followed by a U, and there's a convention in laboratories where a method detection limit or a minimum detectable level is listed. And if a compound is not detected above that minimum detectable level, then the result is reported with the minimum detection level numeric and a U. It's a little bit confusing, but if you have a whole bunch of U's here, that means that the compounds were not detected in your water sample. And I'll just point out that a J means that it's an estimated value. So it was detected, but it wasn't detected at a level where there was a high level of certainty as to what the concentration was. So if you choose to sample your well on your own, you may get a lab report that looks somewhat like this. They do come in different formats, but just wanted to give you another example. This one does not have the ambient groundwater quality standards, so you'd have to look those up on the DES website, but they do provide results here. And in this example, PFOA is 14.4, so that's over the standard of 12. So this would be another ambient groundwater quality violation. And this lab has a different way of describing that no chemical was detected. They say ND or not detected, so it might be a little straightforward to say ND. I've circled that in blue. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to the NHDES PFAS investigation webpage. There's a lot of information here that's helpful on PFAS. We have PFAS information in these menu bar across the top. We have PFAS in drinking water, so there's information on private well testing, the NHDES well testing form, information on PFAS treatment technology. There's an interactive PFAS map viewer where you can look at your neighborhood and see what wells have been sampled and what those results are, frequently asked questions. There's a running PFAS blog down at the bottom you can scroll through. It's got some major milestones in the Gobain site in particular and PFAS in general. So there's a bunch of blog posts. And finally, you can scroll down and subscribe for email alerts. That way, when there's a new blog post placed on the website, you're alerted via email and you can go and take a look at it. So that wraps up my part of the talk. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Kernan.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So I'm going to give a quick overview of some water quality results for PFAS for public water systems in Londonderry. First of all, I want to talk about what a public water system is. In Londonderry, there's parcels that are developed that are getting their water from private wells, such as the information Jeff provided an overview on, private well sampling results. And then there are public water systems in the town. And to be a public water system, you have to go through some criteria that's established by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And this flow chart kind of shows you how you get at if you're a public water system, and then what type of public water system you are, if you fall into that category. And so basically, if you are getting your water from a system that serves at least 15 service connections or 25 people at least 60 days a year, you're a public water system. Once you fall into that category, you then have to figure out what type of system you are. And so if you are getting your water from a system that serves the same 25 people or more and that live on site year round, you're called a community water system. And so that could be things like a small housing development, an apartment complex that has its own on-site well, or some municipal water brought in through water distribution pipelines. And that's the most highly regulated type of water system because the same people are getting the majority of their water from that one system. If you are getting your water from an area where you're not living on site, but that you still serve 25 people or more at least 6 months a year, such as an office or a school that has their own well on site, you're called a non-transient, non-community system, which is still pretty highly regulated. The community water systems and the non-transient, non-community water systems have to routinely sample for PFAS. Now, again, those are where people are going to the same place on a regular basis, getting the same water. If you're a facility that's serving water to more than 25 people at least 6 months a year, but it's likely different people every day, such as maybe a gas station that has a coffee bar or a restaurant, that's called a transient water system. And that's regulated for just some minimal water quality parameters, such as bacteria, nitrate, and nitrate, things that can cause, where you can have health effects with short-term exposure to water. Oops. So in Londonderry, there's a number of public water systems in the different categories I just described. First of all, you have the pipelines of municipal water, mostly Manchester water, that are brought in either through Manchester Waterworks owned and operated water systems, or Pennachuck East Utilities owned and operated water systems. And so that's what these sort of thicker lines are here, is water distribution lines bringing in water from Manchester Waterworks wastewater treatment plant. But then you have also in Londonderry the standalone water systems, where you have developments that are using a local source of water, a well, for their water supply. And so in Londonderry, there's 23 community water systems that have to monitor for PFAS, and then there's 4 non-transient systems that have to monitor for PFAS. There's also 7 transient water systems that aren't subject to PFAS monitoring requirements right now, but DES is sampling these as we speak just to collect data on them. And they're doing it in Londonderry and then eventually statewide. And a summary of PFAS results for Londonderry is shown in this slide. You can see there's 11 water systems. They're shown on this map that have an exceedance of PFOA over our MCL of 12 parts per trillion. And you can see the population served for those systems. The majority of the systems are outside the consent decree area, shown by this black line at this point. And the interesting thing when you look at this map is to see the proximity of those water systems to one another, as well as to the water distribution lines, because that will be useful in looking at long-term alternatives for those systems when they look at treatment or possibly connecting with another water system. I just want to point out that there's a few moving parts in New Hampshire relative to drinking water standards at this point. You heard from Mike Wimsatt earlier about our standards for PFAS for the 4 compounds, but we also have recently lowered our arsenic standard in New Hampshire from 10 parts per billion to 5 parts per billion, and that potentially affects 6 water systems. We are adopting standards for manganese that could impact 4 of those public water systems. And then just point out that in Londonderry, it's a little bit of unusual geology in that we have 7 systems treating for radionuclides, which can often be more technically challenging and more costly. And so it's just important, as you're looking at the cross-section of long-term remedies to address PFAS, that you look at it in the context of other issues these water systems are going to have to address to comply with drinking water standards. And I just want to point out that a number of these smaller standalone systems face some challenges. In addition to having PFAS challenges in Londonderry in this case, we see statewide that these small systems often have challenges with financial and technical capacity to operate, because they just don't have the customer base to pay for water system operators, to pay for buildings, to pay for treatment. And so, their water can get very costly, especially as we start adding treatment trains for PFAS, arsenic, or other contaminants. Another thing to point out with these smaller water systems is that they often don't provide fire protection as well. They're only designed to provide water. And so that's just an important consideration when you're looking at long-term improvements to the small systems and if they have opportunities to connect with larger systems. And with that, we're going to take a 5-minute break. I'll turn it back over to Erin.
Thanks, Brandon. So yeah, thank you. Thanks to everybody that's presented up to this point. So we are going to take a 5-minute break. And as I said, we'll come back and Brandon will pick up talking about basically water, homeowner alternative water options. So really speaking to those residents with private wells. And then we'll move into the funding discussion, the town initiatives, and the Q&A. So I'm going to set the timer. And when we get back, we'll have Brandon live. If you have any issues, again, please reach out to Mary Butow. That's Mary, M-A-R-Y .B-U-T-O-W at des.nh.gov. And she can assist you if you're having any audio or connection issues. So thank you, and we'll be right back. Mhm. Okay, we're just about to get started again. I'll wait until Brandon gets online, and there he is. So this is the second half of our session, and just for those of you who are hanging in there for the Q&A, I don't anticipate the next couple of slides taking very long, and then we'll be moving right into the Q&A session. So thank you for participating up to this point, and we hope that everything has been informative. And with that, I'll turn over to Brandon Kernan, who's going to be talking about the homeowner water, alternative water options.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. First of all, I just want to talk about what we recommend for anyone that's utilizing a private well. At a minimum, we recommend that well owners at least test their water for the 4 PFAS that we currently regulate, as well as a number of other contaminants that could be in anyone's well in New Hampshire, including arsenic bacteria, chloride, copper, fluoride, hardness, iron, lead, manganese, nitrate, pH, radon, sodium, and uranium. And if you do test your well, and there's some good information that recommends, how about go testing your well and where you can find labs. There's this tool that the state has developed where you can then take those results and enter it into. It's called Be Well Informed. If you search the internet for New Hampshire, Be Well Informed, you'll probably get to this page with very little trouble. And what this tool will do is it'll interpret the results for you. It'll tell you the water quality of your well relative to health standards. And then I'll also provide you strategies for installing a treatment train to remove the contaminants in a logical way from your water supply. And this is just a screenshot of the tool. And again, if you have problems finding it, let us know, but most people have no problem finding it just by remembering Be Well Informed. I just want to talk about some treatment options for homeowners for PFAS. First of all, we do have a fact sheet, and that's part of the resources that are being provided. But when you look at treatment for PFAS, you basically have 2 ways of going about it. One, you can do point of use, which is what we call an under a sink dedicated faucet approach, where you designate one tap, usually on the kitchen sink, and it often can be hooked up to your refrigerator if it provides water as well. And you can treat the water from that dedicated tap with either reverse osmosis, which removes PFAS very efficiently, and also removes most other contaminants, which is a real benefit of that treatment technology. Or instead of reverse osmosis, you can use granular activated carbon, which does treat PFAS very effectively, but doesn't really address any of the other contaminants that I mentioned earlier. When you look at carbon, a number of people sell filters for the kitchen sink, that point of use system. But then others are coming up with faucet filters or pitcher filters, and very little studies heard on those type of filters as to how long they'll be effective for. They will reduce PFAS. Studies have shown that, but how long they're effective and if they can remove it to non-detect is something that is somewhat of a concern still. If you want to treat something beyond just a dedicated faucet in your kitchen or somewhere else, you can treat all the water in your house. But for that, you really only have granular activated carbon as a choice. You can't use reverse osmosis because reverse osmosis produces a lot of wastewater and it would be too much water that you have to take from your well. And so you can put in vessels, usually in your basement, to treat all the water coming into your home, maybe bypassing your outside spigots. I'll just note that's not so much an off-the-shelf product like the point-of-use systems are. Generally, that they need to be plumbed together by a water treatment specialist and designed appropriately to handle that volume of water. If you have high radon in your water, though, you really want to address radon before you treated all your water in your home with carbon, because carbon will capture the radon but become somewhat radioactive, and so that's something that needs to be addressed before you put that kind of system inside your home. And I just want to point out there's a number of treatment testing resources available on our website, including links to some studies that show the effectiveness of systems, as well as the National Sanitation Foundation's certified equipment list. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Brandon. So I'm going to just spend a few moments here talking about relevant financial assistance programs, just so you are aware of what's out there and the programs that we manage here at DES. And I just want to highlight that these programs are essentially geared towards public water systems and not residential wells. So Brandon was just talking about point of use for those of you who want something on your faucet, or you can look at a whole house POE system. You know, that's really dealing with the residential well. And what I'm talking about now is public water systems. So a couple of really just important takeaways. Brandon talked about some of the community water systems within the town of Londonderry that are already known that have PFAS exceedances. Whether or not they've received a violation of the actual standard is still to be determined, but we do know those community systems that are impacted with PFAS. And many of these programs I'm going to talk about are applicable. Either one of the programs or more than one are funding opportunities for these types of systems. And so currently our financial assistance programs target a variety of those public water systems, as well as schools and child care centers. The other takeaway is the financial study assistance ranges from studies to assist with decision making, and I'll touch upon in the next slide, design services contracts, so these water systems can design the treatment before it goes out to actually build it and construct it, as well as large-scale infrastructure projects for extending water lines. There is federal stimulus money available. How that can be implemented and used within the state and to address these PFAS issues is still being worked out. And we imagine over the next couple of weeks, months, we'll have much more information on how the federal stimulus money is applicable and would apply to some of these community water systems that need to take on infrastructure projects or treatment to address the PFAS or other contaminants like arsenic that Brandon has mentioned. And then finally, as I mentioned, one of those takeaways is just there is no established funding mechanism at this time for private wells. And then biggest takeaway is myself and Amy Russo really are the ones who oversee these variety of programs that I'll be talking to you about. Amy is focused on the PFAS related, very specific programs for PFAS, while me working with the trust fund, it's a little more broad and can address a variety of issues that water systems are facing. And so just to give kind of the very high level overview of when I talk about these two types of funds, we have the PFAS Remediation Loan Fund. And this fund was established in a statute. There's an enabling statute, RSA 485H, for those who want to go look it up. And this is a loan program that provides low interest loans with the potential for principal forgiveness for eligible water systems. So these are disadvantaged community water systems that would benefit from having a portion of their loan forgiven. And then there's also the potential for a contingent reimbursement for any system that enters into a loan through this program. And that reimbursement would come from any lawsuit monies that the state is awarded. A portion of that will be reimbursed back to the entities that entered into these loan agreements. So it's really a great program for a water system that's facing a significant treatment upgrade or wanting to interconnect with a adjoining public water system to address the PFAS in their wells or in their supply, and an opportunity to get some of that money back in the future. And then the second program, the second primary funding pathway is the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund. This fund was also established in enabling statute 485F. And this comes from the state's lawsuit against ExxonMobil for MTBE contamination. The most important thing about this is the Drinking Water Groundwater Trust Fund is overseen by an advisory commission, and that advisory commission is basically the commission. They make all the funding decisions. And my role at DES and DES's role is to administer those awards, whether it's a grant or a loan to an entity. Could be a public water system, it could be a municipality as well. So There's a lot more flexibility with how the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund can award funds and the types of projects that come in compared to the PFAS remediation loan fund, which is very PFAS specific. So while contamination and addressing contamination continues to be the #1 priority of the Advisory Commission, the trust fund allows us to think out of the box and try to find some unique solutions for the problems that everybody seems to be facing and around the state. So I just wanted to give that sort of high-level overview of these funding programs. And then kind of drilling down into some of the more specific programs that are out there. And again, Amy Russo and myself are going to be your best contacts for these. So one of the programs that Amy manages and supervises is a PFAS treatment design services program. Right now, there's $800,000 appropriated to this program, and all schools and child care systems can apply and are eligible to this program. And what this does is it reimburses up to 26% of the total project cost. So these are, there could be people out in the audience that are listening, or of a child care center that is affected by PFAS in the supply. They could come in and be reimbursed for a portion of the design and the project cost to add treatment or interconnect with another water system. It just helps take away some of that burden of the cost to figure out what to do to address their issues. The second program is through the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund. I would be the primary contact for this program. Earlier this year, we presented a proposal to the Advisory Commission for a $200,000 appropriation to administer a consolidation feasibility study assistance program. It's kind of a mouthful, but really what this is focusing on those small community water systems that Brandon touched upon that typically don't have the capital to hire an engineer to figure out what is the best path forward for us. How do we address this PFAS issue? How do we address arsenic? Maybe we have a dry well. This program is a grant program, first come, first serve, as long as the system meets the eligibility criteria. And what it does is it gives the grant recipient $10,000 grant to develop what a feasible solution for their situation is. And every situation is different. And what I really want to highlight here is it can be used for PFAS, but it's also for any MCL exceedance. So again, if your system is facing other contaminants such as arsenic or manganese and PFAS or anything like that, that you have an exceedance, this is a program that can help you with your future decision making. And I say future decision making because what I'm talking about here is things that can start being done now and today. But obviously there is some long-term solution that is being looked at and evaluated, whether it's inside the consent decree area or outside of the consent decree area. It's really important for these small systems to be ready for what might come. If there's a water line extension that's coming in front of their condo association or manufactured home park, it's going to be important that the system, the residents are ready to make a decision on how they want to proceed. And that's really the purpose of this consolidation assistance grant. It doesn't cover infrastructure or any construction. It's really just a paper program to take away the hurdle of hiring an engineer and doing this work, and lets the system really get that thinking done and working with the experts to help them come up with that solution. And then again, I touched upon the PFAS remediation loan fund. This is Amy Russo's fund. This is the low interest loan program for really its capital infrastructure. Community and nonprofit, non-transient public water systems are eligible, and this has a contingent reimbursement associated with it. And then finally, the pathway through the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund. Right now, there's about $153 million available in the corpus. Public water systems, any size are eligible, municipalities, any political subdivision of the state, so your village districts, all of these entities are eligible to apply. And we have the Special Projects Assistance Program, which applications can come in at any time. And priority, obviously, the Commission is focused on helping these systems solve their contamination issue through grants and loans. And I just put a little line there. So generally, anything that says PFAS program is a PFAS specific, and they must exceed an MCL. And then the consolidation study program, although PFAS is definitely applicable, it is applicable for other MCLs that could be exceeded by a community water system. And just to finish up, here's a list of relevant links. These will bring you to information about the programs, applications, and you'll find contact information as well. And I do want to say in the handouts, there is a sheet, a reference sheet that has everybody's contact information. So if you have any questions or you want to talk about your specific needs or your systems needs, feel free to reach out to myself or Amy, and we will certainly guide you on the right path. And so with that, we'll move right into the Q&A. So I don't think I'm gonna, it might not be a full 5 minutes, but, oh, I'm sorry, Lisa, thank you for jumping on. I didn't put a slide in there. I apologize for that. So,
no problem at all. I just wanted to introduce myself to everybody that has joined. I'm Lisa Doybeck. I'm the Assistant Town Manager for Londonderry. I'm one of the staff liaisons to the PFAS Task Force, and I am just going to talk very, very briefly, because I know we want to get to the Q&A, about what the town is doing. So, of course, we've created the PFAS Task Force, which is made up of 9 residents, as well as Tom Dolan, one of our town councilors, who chairs the task force, and Bob Carey, our environmental engineer. And they are tasked with studying the PFAS issue, providing guidance to residents, and as well as the town council about what our options are going forward. And as Chairman Dolan referenced at the top of this meeting, the next thing they're going to be doing is hosting a, I'm calling it a vendor fair, think job fair, if you will, with tables set around the LHS cafeteria on June 17th, with more details to follow. But we're going to have testing vendors there, mitigation vendors for these point of entry, point of use systems, so you can talk to them live and in person. And DES will also be there to answer more of your questions, should you have any. So more details will follow about that. Of course, we'll put everything on the website and social media, publicize it like we did for this informational session. Another thing that we're doing is we are actively engaged, town staff, our elected officials, with conversations, ongoing conversations, not only with DES, who has been an incredible help to us, but also our local, state, and federal elected officials, so that we can let them know what our needs are once we figure out exactly what they are, but also they're helping us monitor legislation. There might be some legislative fixes out there, and that would apply mostly to longer term solutions. So if we get to the point where we want to investigate a townwide water system or bringing public water to certain parts of town, that's where our efforts are focused in that arena. In the here and now, our next objective as the town is to apply for a grant through the Drinking Water Trust Fund that Aaron was just addressing. It's kind of a new and innovative program that we're going to pitch to the trust fund. We would like to tap into a certain amount of money, as much as they'll give us, basically, to see if we could put together some sort of rebate program for our residents outside the consent decree area whose wells have tested in exceedance of the PFAS standards. Because the folks inside the consent decree area, of course, are able to access bottled water through St. Gobain. This is meant to be sort of a stopgap measure right now as we investigate longer term solutions. But the way that we envision this rebate program working, and again, we don't know if we'll be able to do this, we've got to apply for the grant, would be to allow residents to take their own action, based on their well results, whether you would like to choose, a bottled water delivery system or a water pitcher, a point of use, point of entry, whatever you think is appropriate for you and your family. We're not going to make that choice for you. And what we would do is then have an application that you could fill out. You take whatever action you needed to, fill out an application, and we would hopefully be able to provide a rebate of maybe up to $500 to each homeowner who applies for this. So we're trying to help out a little bit if we're able to secure some grant funding. Stay tuned on that. We, of course, will publicize it everywhere if we're awarded a grant and can make this rebate program available, and we'll make it as simple as possible. So that's all I wanted to convey to you tonight. I want to thank DES, of course, and now I'm going to let you get to your questions.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for jumping on before I moved us forward too far. So, yep, we're gonna, basically right now, we're gonna make the question function live. And I am going to bring Amy Russo on to, let me make sure I just did that. I'll bring Amy Russo on to walk you through how to do the question and answers and some of the ground rules that we'd like to have for tonight. So with that, Amy, I will give you mouse control if you want to come on with your camera.
All right. Thank you, Erin. Let's see if I can. I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. I got it. Okay. Okay. So while everyone is taking a 5-minute break and the panelists are taking a little bit of a break, I'm going to go through how you can ask your questions. So, to start, we want you to identify yourself using the question function that Erin just put into play. So let me go forward a couple of slides and explain how this works. So on your dashboard, if you can't see the dashboard live right now, you will see this orange rectangle with a white arrow right facing. If you click on that, it should open up your dashboard. And then down in the gray shaded options, you'll see questions. If you click on that, it'll open up a box, and then there's a spot where it says enter questions for staff. We're asking that you put your first and last name in this box and your town of residence, because we do recognize there may be people from outside the town of Londonderry in attendance tonight. We are asking that you do not type your question in this box. So it's just your first and last name and your town of residence. You will have a chance to be unmuted and ask your question live. So that's why we're asking that you do not type your question in the box. And then you can press send. And again, if you're having any issues with this, you can get some technical assistance from Mary Butow that's Mary, M-A-R-Y .butow at butow@des.nh.gov. And her phone number is 603-271-8693. Let me go back. All right, so we're going to monitor this question function, and we're going to call upon each attendee in the order in which we receive your name in the queue. You're going to be identified, and I will unmute you and invite you to ask your question to the panel. We do want to note here that we're going to unmute you on our end, but you might be self-muted on your end. So when we say that you're unmuted, just make sure that you're unmuted on your end. And there's a little microphone on your dashboard. If it's red with a line through it, that means you're self-muted. If it's green, that means you should be able to communicate with us. All right, so when it is your turn to speak and we unmute you, we're asking that you state your first and last name. And this is because the name that appears from the registration online might not necessarily be the person that is speaking with us. So if you could just identify yourself before asking your question, it would be much appreciated. We are asking that you limit anything you want to say or questions to 3 minutes. There is a lot of people in attendance, and we want to make sure that we can address everybody's questions. So to accommodate everyone in the queue, we would like you to limit yourself to 3 minutes, please. If you do find that you run out of time or you've come up with other questions as we move along, you can always re-enter your name into that question function and get yourself back onto the queue to ask some additional questions. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this up again. This is how to use the question function. And so you can start putting in your names as of right now, and we're going to start a queue And in a minute or two, once all the panelists have come back on, Jim Martin is going to put up that queue list for everybody to see so you can see where you are in line to ask your question. And so while we're waiting on that, I just also want to mention that there are some handouts on your dashboard in the handout feature. I believe there's 4 handouts in there tonight with some additional information. Erin mentioned earlier that there is going to be a Dropbox link. In this Dropbox are going to be those handouts, some additional information, the presentation slides, and the video of tonight's meeting. That Dropbox link is going to be emailed in about a day or so to all the attendees and registrants. And so you should get an email with that Dropbox link there to access all of that information. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Erin.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to pull off of this slide and we'll be showing up the queue here. So give me a second so we can get the queue showing. And I'll ask the panelists to come on. Okay, Jim, I've shared, you're the presenter, so you can share your screen. There we go. And I'll just take a moment. Thank you, Jeff Martz, because I forgot to introduce Amy Russo at the very beginning. And so obviously I talked about her in the funding and as a primary contact, but also Kathy Beam, who's with the Air Resources Division, and Amy Doherty, who's the state site supervisor who manages the sites that are not associated with St. Gobain. That's Jeff who manages that. So sorry, Amy, Kathy, and Amy. Glad you could join us. And I think we'll just maybe give it one more minute. And Jim, are you seeing a long list that you need some time to keep putting names up, or are you okay?
It's a long list, but you guys can get started because I have quite a few in there. Are you seeing it on the screen yet?
We are.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So with that, we'll get started. And Amy, just let us know when Paul's unmuted.
Paul, you're unmuted and can ask your question.
Why, thank you. And I'm sorry for jumping the gun on typing the question in the block there. What I was wondering was, has DES found any commercial or industrial PFAS sources other than St. Gobain that are near Londonderry that have been or are discharging PFAS in the recent past or still are? I don't mean like a one-time spill or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, probably Amy Doherty.
Yeah, Paul, this is Amy Doherty. Just to answer your question, one of the slides that Jeff showed depicted a number of discharge sites that are currently under investigation. There's a handful in Londonderry. They're not a tremendous number, but I think maybe 10. I think I counted 10 or 11, and they are under various stages of investigation at this point. But none of those, I would say, really travel long distance. They're pretty discrete releases that we have a somewhat of a good handle on at this point.
Thank you. I mean, are there any sources just outside Londonderry other than St. Gobain?
Yes, there are a number of different types of releases across the state from various industrial, commercial type discharges and releases, uses of AFFF foam to put out car fires, things of that nature. So there are a number of sites across the state.
Thank you.
Okay. Ron Dunn.
Good. Thank you for taking my question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm wondering, how long does the consent decree allow people that are west of High Range Road to receive bottled water?
Mike Wimsatt?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the. So basically, under the consent decree, St. Gobain is responsible for 3 primary things. One is to sample and investigate, which is ongoing. And the second one is that where they find impacts to drinking water wells that are above standards, they're required to provide, alternate interim solution for clean water while they're developing a permanent solution, and that would be in bottled water. And so they're required to provide that until they implement a permanent solution to provide clean alternate water, which in many cases will be extension of public water systems. Does that answer?
Yeah, I just had a lot of people wondering, like, if the town decides on a solution and they get the rebate program and there's different solutions developed by the PFAS task force, will people lose the ability to get the bottled water from Monadnock?
So it's important to draw the distinction between those folks who are living inside the consent decree outer boundary and outside. So inside the consent decree outer boundary, again, St. Gobain will be responsible for developing that permanent solution. So for example, if they decide, or if it's decided that they need to construct an extension of a public water system to a group of homes that are currently they're serving with bottled water, once they provide that extension of the water line and they connect those homes to a water system, they would no longer be required to provide bottled water. If you talk about folks outside the consent decree area, it wouldn't be St. Gobain that would be providing that long-term solution. But similarly, I mean, I guess for argument's sake, if the permanent solution that were developed were an extension of public water and we were found a way to do that and get that done, then even if there's a rebate program set up that's providing folks with the opportunity to get rebates for purchasing bottled water or a POU system or what have you, then once they're connected to a water system, I would imagine that would not continue. I mean, that rebate program that Lisa Drabick talked about would be a town effort. So I'm not sure DES could weigh in on exactly how it might be administered.
Just a quick follow-up. So someone like myself that lives within the consent decree, I would want to wait to hear from St. Gobain for a solution before I implemented one myself.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, to be fair, there are some folks who have decided that they, across this study area, not just in Londonderry, who decided they want to put in their own treatment because they don't want to use bottled water. So that's a personal decision. I wouldn't advise you one way or the other about that. But if you're satisfied with bottled water for the interim period, certainly you have an expectation, if you're above standards, that there will be a permanent solution that will be offered to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Massimo Hagan.
Hi, name's Massimo Hagan. I live in Londonderry, and I have a question about, since these are airborne generated compounds that ultimately end up in the groundwater, do these compounds, if you're taking a shower, if your well's bad, because the doctor said that skin contact is not necessarily a way of, that's low risk, but do they, like radon, for example, where it mists up in the water, do these compounds become inhalable? And, if they go into your lungs, would they, would you be at as much risk? I realize you don't spend all day in the shower, but would that be a concentrated level exposure? And just to follow up to that, is bottled water, I mean, there's this material in plastics, so isn't that sort of ironic that we get bottled water that, the plastics contain the PFOAs?
It will have to, Jonathan, I think you probably can answer both of those questions.
Yeah, so I can take yes. So as far as showering goes, with the long chain PFAS that we're currently regulating, there's not a lot of evidence to show that they basically become vapors, so under your typical hot shower condition. However, this is an area of evolving research, and we don't have a lot of clear information on whether or not they can or cannot vaporize that way. I would defer to Kathy Bean to sort of state a little bit more of what we understand about how it's transported in air. But at this time, that's really not considered the primary risk. There may be some concern with shorter chain compounds that aren't regulated at this time. But right now, we really just don't have the data to know one way or another if there's a significant risk from shower exposure from that vapor situation. Along those similar lines, in case anyone else is wondering, we also sometimes get questions from people asking if they're using a home humidifier, can they still put this water in that? And usually for most home humidifiers, you're supposed to use some sort of deionized or very purified water. and that's just per its own instructions. So if there's any other contaminants or things from well water in there, that can sort of gunk up the humidifier. The second part of that, before I pass it off to Kathy to follow up on the vapor piece, is about bottled water. So when we rolled out the MCLs back in 2019, there was some testing done of bottled water supplies to see which ones met the MCLs, and that data is available on our website, and Brandon Kernan can either point to that, or if you just contact any of us, we can direct you there. But there were some places that were found that had some exceedances, but overall it didn't seem to be a large issue. I know our Department of Health and Human Services right now is actually working on rulemaking, so that way bottled water companies will have to meet those same standards as public water supplies. So the Department of Health and Human Services regulates bottled water as a consumer product, and we are working with them on that. Kathy, is there anything you wanted to add to?
Yes, John. So thank you for the question. As was mentioned, there are many different PFAS compounds in the family of PFAS chemicals, and they all have different chemical properties, but most of them have vapor pressures or vapor temperature boiling points that are higher than your typical hot water temperature in your shower or whatnot. So that is, in our estimate, not a likely vaporization type of situation. Really, the vaporization of the compounds at St. Gobain were at much higher temperatures than a typical shower.
Understood. I'd like to thank you all.
Thank you. Brendan McCauley.
Give me a second.
Okay. Sorry, Amy.
No worries. I am not finding. Hold on. Oh, it looks like Brendan has left.
Okay. Okay. Then we'll move to Michelle Dantas. Sorry if I'm butchering names. My maiden name is Staniszewski, so I wouldn't expect anybody to get that at the first time, so I apologize. Michelle.
Okay, now I was able to unmute it.
Okay,
yeah, Michelle Dantas, thanks for trying. Oh, good evening, thank you for the webinar. And my first question is, how do I know if my property is part of the consent decree? Is there a website that I can go check, or should I just call the town?
That'd be Jeff Martz. How can she find? Yeah, how can she find out about whether or not she's in the consent decree?
So on the PFAS website that I mentioned, the mapper option has the boundary of the consent decree on it. So you could go to the PFAS mapper, type in your address and zoom in. And if your property is within the shaded area that shows up, you're inside the consent decree. If you know that your property is on the west side of High Range Road, in all likelihood, it's within the consent decree. And lastly, if you just want to call me directly, I can look it up on my computer and easily let you know where your property is located.
Okay, and how do I know for how long the water have been contaminated? To know how long my family have been exposed in my bed.
So these
is that possible to find out?
So these chemicals, the St. Gobain facility has been in operation formerly as a ChemFab. Another company operated it, but essentially did the same process dating back to the mid-1980s. So these compounds were thought to be released to the air starting in the mid-1980s and have been working their way into the groundwater. So I think it's fair to say that, yeah, these chemicals have been in the ground for, a period of years to potentially decades.
Oh.
And Kathy, oh, sorry.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yes, you can. Yep.
Okay. And in regarding the discounts, I know the another discount, the expenses, the rebates. It seems to me that might take a little longer, and I'm not sure if I qualify for bottled water help. I honestly haven't looked into it. But I was looking to get the carbon filter so I can have all the house protected. Is this, if I decided to do this now before the permanent decision, would I qualify for any rebate if the town is granted the funds?
So Erin, if I could jump in, again, I have to put the qualifier out there that we have to apply for the grant first and see if we're awarded the grant. But what we would propose as part of the grant is that the program would be retroactive. So by the time we get the money and if we do, and get a rebate program in place, we understand people want to take action now. So we would make it retroactive to a certain date. Probably going back a couple of years, maybe when DES started testing in Londonderry. All of this has to be established within the strictures of the grant, but we would hope to make it retroactive, if that helps answer your question.
Absolutely, yes it did. Thanks, Lisa. Thank everyone, have a good evening. Thanks for this.
Thank you, Michelle. Gabe is, I'm not even gonna try.
I am unmuted, so I don't have to worry about playing with it, right?
Yep, you're all set. We can hear you.
Beautiful. I like that. Technology is great, especially when you know what you're doing, but I don't. Anyway, thank you for taking my call. I mean, this is unbelievable. Usually when I'm on a web call, I'm usually like about an hour in. So this is great. And the reason for my call is even though I am out of state, I've been a property owner in New Hampshire for the past 40 years. And before I get to my question, just to give you a qualifier, I was very active when an organization called the Wilds Christian Association tried to build a very large hotel near an aquifer in Meredith. And that was very troubling. And luckily, the powers that be and saner minds came in and they went away. But now going to the PFAS issue, now we're at the present. And I'm really concerned about what the turnkey landfill was doing back in 2012 when the City of Lowell's wastewater treatment plant was accepting their PFAS-laden waste. And just by way of full disclosure, I was their consultant at that time, and I was clueless about what was going on. So I felt like that was a real not way to do it. And luckily, Merrimack, I think it was the Merrimack Watershed Association, blew the whistle on what was going on because they were polluting the lower Merrimack River. And Lowell decided, okay, we've got egg in our face. We better make believe like we're going to do the right thing. So my question to you going forward is, what is DES doing with respect to turnkey to make sure they don't play this game again? And is DES also monitoring other such landfills and other such commercial industrial establishments so that they don't pollute our groundwaters, they don't pollute our surface waters, and that all of us will be able to have access to clean, potable water? And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yep. Go ahead,
Thank
Mike.
you for the question. So yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So the short answer is that with respect to landfills, we are certainly aware that landfills that are operated taking municipal solid waste do generate leachate that contains PFAS. So we have monitored and we have sampled leachate from all of our operating landfills, and we pretty uniformly see PFAS in those landfills. Right now, the lawful thing that those landfills can do is to collect that leachate as they're required to do under the permits. They containerize it, they truck it to waste plants lawfully and have it treated at those wastewater plants. Those plants, we're in a situation right now where we actually have enforceable surface water standards, but I know that all the plants are looking at their potential impacts on the receiving waters where they discharge their wastes. So that's an area that's really of both emerging science and emerging regulatory framework. So I don't know if that answers your question. The main issue that we want to make sure of is that the leachate is being collected removed from the landfill and trucked to wastewater plants where it can be lawfully treated and discharged.
Right, but I guess a follow-up question to that is, what happens when a treatment plant like Lowell basically doesn't adequately treat that PFAS waste and it still goes into the receiving water? And you have downstream communities that basically utilize that water as their drinking water, such as the cities of Haverhill, the cities of Lawrence that are downstream from Lowell. I'd imagine it's the same thing in New Hampshire along the Merrimack.
Sure, and any drinking water plants that have intakes on river or any place else for that matter are required to monitor the source water and make sure that it meets applicable drinking water standards for PFAS and many other contaminants. And if it doesn't, then they need to treat that water. So right now we're not aware of any drinking water systems that take in source water from a surface water like a river where that river water exceeds any of the standards. We do detect PFAS in rivers, but it's generally at very low concentrations that are nowhere close to the applicable standards.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your time, and thank you for having this session. I hope there are more.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabe.
Sure.
Next, we have Joan Glynn.
Hi, thank you for doing this webinar. It's been very helpful. Part of my question was already answered, but I was just wondering, is there a timeline as to when St. Gobain decides on the mitigation solution for those in the consent decree area?
I think, yeah, Mike Wimsatt, we'll start there.
Sure, that's a great question. So, I think it's been a source of frustration for everyone that, we discovered this problem 5 years ago, and a lot of work went into it in the early going where we had exceedances that were over 70, and we were able to, develop plans to address those wells that were impacted above those standards. There were miles and miles of drinking water infrastructure that were constructed and hundreds of homes that were connected that previously were served by private drinking water wells that were connected to public water systems. Now, if you fast forward to 2020, when the standards got lowered, that meant that suddenly, hundreds, and Londonderry contributes to that, hundreds of additional homes were impacted above that new lower standard. And so we're back at it where we're trying to get our arms around the full extent and scope of those wells that are impacted above standards and develop new long-term systems, which will very likely include extension of drinking water systems. As we worked with St. Gobain and pressed them on this, it's our understanding that they expect that their sampling efforts inside the consent decree will be largely concluded by the end of this calendar year. And that next year, in 2022, they would be on to developing, proposing, water line extensions and any other solutions that they might propose, and designing those and looking to get those built as promptly as possible.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joan. Next, we have John Goglia.
Sure. You just answered one of my questions about the time frame that they're actually going to put in this permanent fix for us that are affected. But also, you just mentioned that the threshold had been lowered. Do you guys see that threshold changing back to a higher threshold, and that this problem could be just go away with us that are affected?
I'll start to answer that, and then I want to maybe turn it over to Dr. Ali. So right now, we do not anticipate that we would be increasing the standard such as to sort of make the problem go away. The data that we received and the data that we analyzed in order to set those standards is still, we believe current and appropriate. But what we are doing is continuing to monitor any new research with respect to these compounds. And John, I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we do is try to keep track of any new studies that are coming out with these, and specifically studies related to health risk assessment. So this is either toxicology studies in animals, epidemiology studies in populations of people who have been exposed to these chemicals, and also improved ways that we can model and predict what a certain concentration in water becomes in people. So this is something that we regularly keep tabs on. It's also an evolving area of research. So sometimes data suggests that a lower standard might be necessary, sometimes a higher number. We do keep track of this to see what the most compelling evidence is. And that's something that we make that recommendation to the department whenever there's new necessary data. At this time, there's not really any data that we have that's giving us a compelling argument to raise the number or be less protective with this. But again, it's a process. So depending on what the data reveals, especially from the national studies that are going on right now, that could have an impact on the number down the road. But in the immediate future, we don't see a reason to change that.
All right, so just another question here. So because of the area that we live in a circle, and I think there was 18 of us that were tested, and we're all above, so we all are on bottled service. But I guess the biggest question would be, is the public water supply going to be in groundwater, or is it going to be where they take these certain areas that are, you know, less affected and say, all right, we're just going to put in a whole house filtering system, I guess? Are there two options, or is there only one option on the table, meaning that we're going to get public supply, or versus an in-house system?
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
So that's a great question. I think that the best answer for that is that it really depends on DES's approach to alternate water is that we view connection to a regulated public water system where it is feasible and practicable as the best solution to provide long-term safe drinking water. So if where you're located, it can practically be you know, an extension of a water line can be designed and can be extended and constructed, and then your homes on the circle could be connected to it. That is likely the solution that would be selected. And where it's practicable, that's what we would expect the company to do. There may be other circumstances where, because of distance or other barriers, it's really impracticable and not a reasonable solution. And in those cases, as a second choice, basically, whole house treatment could be elected.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, John. Next we have Tam Siekman. Tam?
Hi. So my question is, I have a couple questions. Why is the New Hampshire DES not amending the 2018 St. Gobain consent decree to meet the 12 parts per trillion instead of 70 parts per trillion and expand the pre-GMZ? And to follow up on that, why does the New Hampshire DES not seem to use the DuPont, the major manufacturers of PFAS drinking water standard of 1 part per billion?
Okay, Mike?
Okay, so I'll try to take that in order. So as far as the consent decree goes, that was a legal agreement that was negotiated and entered into by our Department of Justice in representing the state of New Hampshire and attorneys for St. Gobain. And if it were to be amended, it would take the cooperation and consent of both of the parties. So that becomes a difficult thing. Certainly, we would like to amend the consent decree and draw the line in a different place, but it's not clear that we're going to be in a position to do that. And I may have missed a question in between, but I think the latter question you asked was why is DES not observing a 1 part per billion standard that's been suggested by manufacturers? And the simple answer to that is that we develop our own standards using a careful review of the science, the toxicology, and the risk assessment research that's out there. And Dr. Ali and his colleagues did that really in a very rigorous way when we were asked to set these standards. And we stand by that work. We stand by the research that we reviewed to develop those numbers. And that's, I don't think anyone would want us to do it any other way. And did I miss a question in between? I feel like there was a third one.
No, that was all good. Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Lee Breslow. Lee?
Hi. Yeah, so it's Lee
Hi.
Buslow in Londonderry.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
So my first question is water usage. You talked about cooking and drinking and things like that. If you're above the PFOA standard, if you exceed the standard, what about things like washing vegetables, things like that? Fruits, vegetables, grains, and washing any food, anything that you're going to consume.
Yeah, Jonathan Ali.
Sure, thank you. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind with this is basically the PFAS are being transported in the water. So if you are washing and drying vegetables, things like that, it's probably a low risk activity. Again, though, if you're taking those vegetables and you're keeping a lot of that water, so say you're cooking with it or you're retaining that somehow, that does increase the risk. Ultimately, though, the drinking water standard was established for ingestion of that water as a drinking water source, not for washing fruits and vegetables. So it's sort of a risk management decision that you have to make on your own. It's probably a very low risk activity. It is important to wash all fruits and vegetables because even if you're growing them at home, you know, New Hampshire soils, we have heavy metals, we have other contaminants that are just naturally present in soils. So you want to make sure you wash all of those off. So it's probably a low risk activity, but at this time we don't have a clear cutoff number to tell you if it's safe or not for washing vegetables. But again, if you're washing things off, drying it, removing that excess water, that's a fairly low risk activity.
Okay, thanks. And then if you're within the consent decree area, is there any information yet about what the end cost would be for the homeowner? So, you know, we're talking about putting water lines potentially down the street, although some of us are in pretty rural areas, and that seems far-fetched to me. But would there be like connection fees for the homeowner or things like that?
Sure, that's a great question. So, you know, the good news, we don't have to sort of guess about this because we've already done it. There have been, you know, many new water lines and hundreds of folks connected. And the way that it works is that the company, if you're inside the consent decree and the determination is that extension and connection to a water line is the remedy, then the water line construction, the curb stop at the street, and then the running the line over your property into your home and doing the interior plumbing connections are all costs that are borne by the responsible party, by St. Gobain. After that, you know, once you connect to a water system, you have a monthly water bill. That monthly water bill is the responsibility of the property owner.
Okay, but no connection fees then. Thank you. Appreciate all the information.
Sure.
You're welcome. Thank you, Lee. Next we have George Katsioka. George.
Hi there. I've been to a couple of these sessions, and each one is more illuminating than the previous. You guys are doing a great job at providing information. I think this is probably going towards Dr. Ali. This is so the standards that were set were lowered from the national EPA standards because there wasn't a cumulative effect in the body. And I guess I was kind of like wondering, is there some accumulation rate that has been determined, measured, assessed? And I guess a follow-on would be, is there like a half-life or a natural elimination rate or some way of eliminating the compounds?
Yeah, sure, that's a good question. So to be very clear upfront, the value of 70 parts per trillion put forward by the EPA is a lifetime health advisory. That's not an enforceable standard. It's a little nuanced, but it has a different meaning for how it rolls out and what it means as regulation. When they developed that, they were trying to account for accumulation, but they were looking at less sensitive effects than what our agency considered. So for example, EPA based their effects or their standard off of trying to protect specifically for birth defects. But we found that at lower levels, you can still have liver toxicity, you can still have immune system toxicity, You can have reproductive toxicity, especially for women. And we determined that we wanted to protect for those more sensitive effects than something like potential birth defects. So that's why we set a much lower level. We want to protect for those more sensitive things. As far as actually quantifying what this bioaccumulation means, half-lives have been estimated for this, and they're based on human data where we have seen communities who have drank these chemicals in drinking water. And when you put on treatment, we measure their blood for PFAS over time after they've had treatment put on, and we can watch those chemicals eliminate. The half-life for a chemical like PFOA, depending on your sex, age, and a couple of other factors, can range from a year up to 5 years. So that's the amount of time it takes for your body to eliminate half of this. So it can take close to decades for your body to fully eliminate these chemicals. And in fact, that's why most people have some detectable level of PFAS in their body, is throughout the 90s and early 2000s, when these were in a lot of commercial products, people were exposed to them. They were in fast food packaging and a lot of other uses. So people had some contact with them, and we're still eliminating them. And when we look at national data, the general trend for these 4 compounds is starting to go down, but we realize it takes several years for your body to eliminate these. So the final part of your question, I believe, was, is there any way that we can just naturally get rid of these? And basically the way we get rid of them is we slowly eliminate them in our urine. And the problem is our kidneys, for some reason, seem to pull these back into our blood, and they don't let go of them. So it's our own body doing this to us because there's something about the chemical that our body finds attractive, but it causes this long half-life where it takes years to get rid of these. There hasn't been really any solid medical treatment that's been come up with to remove these. So with heavy metals, we can give chelation therapy to pull a heavy metal out of the body. There's not really been anything developed like that for these compounds. So at this time, it's sort of a thing where left with not many answers. But what we do know is women tend to eliminate these faster than men. Some of that's just inherent biology. Some of it has to do with releasing them either through breast milk, through blood, mainly menstruation, as well as in the process of giving birth, because you're putting a certain amount of these chemicals into the infant, and when they're born, they take that out with them. So most people alive today have some level of these chemicals in them. We are watching them go down. That's why it's important to reduce exposure, is so that way you can keep having that trend. Did I answer all your questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that half-life thing. I know that this was like always called a forever chemical, forever material, but the fact that it has a half-life is reassuring. One follow-up, and I know you call this complex related to like blood sampling. Is there like a list of test labs that can do PFAS blood assays? I realize that there is no interpretation or anything else, but just to simply set a baseline of what the PFAS levels are.
Yeah, so you go back to the presentation. There is a link there for the Department of Health and Human Services, New Hampshire's Department of Health and Human Services. They actually have a list that they did put together a few years back of labs that are capable of doing this kind of blood testing. It's changing as the market is changing. So really the best thing to do is start by talking to your physician, see if they're comfortable with ordering that test and seeing if it's appropriate for you. And then they can usually go through whoever their contract lab is. Very few doctors' offices actually have a lab in the back that does all their chemistry for them. So they can contact their lab. It may be something that they have to specialty send out, sometimes to certain labs in California. But the list is changing. We do have a list on the DHHS website, but again, your physician may have a different lab that has that capability now, and it's best to start by talking with them.
Okay, super. Thank you very much, Doctor. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Next, we have Bobby Jean.
Hi, thank you. I have 2 questions, and I think I have the answer to one because Lee had sort of asked earlier, but is brushing your teeth a low risk activity?
Sure, I'll take that one again.
John.
So in general, brushing your teeth, in an ideal situation, if you're brushing your teeth the way that you should, you're supposed to be spitting everything out, not ingesting any of it. So that's considered a low risk activity. However, if you have small children that maybe have a hard time spitting everything out, or if you're someone with some sort of neuromotor problems that maybe have a hard time swallowing, I'm thinking of something like maybe Bell's palsy, where there's some sort of partial paralysis. You know, if you're concerned about that additional exposure, if you're sort of in a sensitive group, then using alternative source of water might be more appropriate in that situation. But in general, for most oral care, you're supposed to be spitting everything out. You don't have as much ingestion. It's not considered a high risk. So it sometimes depends on if you have some other situation going on where you have difficulty controlling that, you might have significant incidental ingestion.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question is in regards to the filters. I am going to sign up for that bottled water, but I purchased a filter, and when I went on, I don't know where, what link I had clicked to find PFAS appropriate filters, but it's a little overwhelming because I don't recognize a lot of the stuff and I don't really understand what it's talking about. And so how do I know if I'm really buying something that works and not something that just reduces it a little bit, but now I'm still, I drink a lot of water, so am I consuming something that's still over standard?
Brandon or Amy, do either of you?
Sure. So on those links, there is a list of companies and filter types that have been certified by either National Sanitation Foundation and even studies by EPA on specific filter systems, reverse osmosis or granular activated carbon, that show the ones that were effective and the ones that were less, and they give the name, brand, and the type of filter. The other thing you can look to, though, is the manufacturer themselves. You know, PFAS is nationally a pretty hot topic right now, and most of these mainstream manufacturers are testing for PFAS and sharing their results, so you can approach it that way. And then lastly, we do provide homeowners technical assistance. We have a number of people that will talk to homeowners that have questions about treatment, or you could work with a water treatment company that has demonstrated experience in effectively treating PFAS to also address some of those concerns. There's a few ways you can get at it, or you can go at it through all those avenues to get to the right place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madison Giro.
Hi there, it's Madison Giro.
Sorry.
No, it's all good, all good. My boyfriend and I bought a home in Londonderry in July, and we are first-time homeowners. And we very stupidly accepted the seller's disclosure that he had the water tested during the buying process and found no evidence of anything in the water. And obviously, in hindsight, we understand that we should have gotten our own test to verify this. And you may not have the answer to this, but my first question is there a legal obligation to disclose the discovery of PFOAs, which obviously were present before we purchased the home? We have a private well, and we had our water tested 6 weeks ago and found that our PFOA level is 20 ppt, but unfortunately we're east of High Range Road. So from what I've heard so far tonight, it doesn't really seem like there's anything that we can do right now other than purchase our own water filtration system. That's all I got.
So I don't know. Yeah, I was going to say, Mike, maybe you want to take that question.
Sure. So as first of all, I'm sorry to hear your story. First of all, to your first question, that's a legal question. There are laws associated with representations on sale of homes, but neither I nor DES is really qualified to advise you on that. So I would advise you to consult an attorney on that question. As far as given your location where you're outside the consent decree, as we presented here tonight, we are acutely aware that there are many homes outside the consent decree that are impacted, and we are working to sample and working to develop long-term solutions. We're going to be working very closely with the town on that. So my hope for you would be that there will be a solution in coming out that will give you some assistance. In the meantime, again, the Londonderry has talked about some kind of, looking to try to develop some kind of a rebate program that might be able to help people like you who might want to do something in the interim by way of, POU treatment system or bottled water or something. And then, beyond that, it's really a question of, we don't have really a concrete answer for you tonight. I can only tell you that I guess misery loves company. There are an awful lot of people whose wells are impacted outside the consent decree, and we're going to be looking to develop a solution for all of those folks. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's what I can offer.
Yeah, I didn't fully expect a full answer. But so essentially, if we do go ahead and pull the trigger on buying a new water filtration system, there's potentially the hope of being reimbursed in some way.
Yeah, I would hesitate to say, because everything is so uncertain at this point. But what I would advise you is, whatever you decide to do, certainly keep records and receipts of what you do, because obviously if you don't have those, it makes it very difficult to have a conversation later. And the other thing, you reminded me of something that I meant to say during my presentation, which may or may not be applicable to you, but it is important to understand that when we negotiated the consent agreement, that is an agreement solely between the state of New Hampshire and St. Gobain with respect to how New Hampshire will assert its legal authorities against a responsible party who's caused contamination. We did not in any way bargain away any individual's rights with respect to that. So to the extent that folks who have been, had their wells impacted or been harmed in some way, I just want to make it clear that nothing that the state of New Hampshire has negotiated has in any way infringed on your individual rights to take whatever actions you deem appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much.
Madison, this is Amy Doherty. If I could just make one comment. You indicated that you sampled the well yourself, and I would just make the plug that if you wanted to share that data with us and provide that to either Jeff Martz or myself, obviously if you're outside the consent decree, you can just send it to me. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation, but that would be very informative to us to put into our database so we could use it to continue to evaluate the area. The more data we have, the better decision making, the better decisions we can make.
Absolutely.
So I would encourage you to submit that to me, and my email contact, it will be at the end. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's already highlighted, circled, starred to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Madison. Thanks, Amy. So we have Craig Thomas.
Hey, how are you guys?
Hi.
I think you guys actually might have just answered pretty much my question with that last one. I guess two parts. One was in regards to being west or east of high range. I know, Jeff, you had mentioned that we could look on the map. If you could just tell me how to look on the map again, because I actually fall where High Range Road ends at 102. I'm directly across the street on Old Range, so I don't know if that's actually east or west, because I could see High Range. In my levels, we got the water tested a couple months ago because we got the letter from you guys, and our levels are at a 28. So I have two little kids that are 6 and 3, so we went ahead and jumped the gun and just bought a reverse osmosis system. Obviously not a cheap investment, but felt like it was needed. And we had it put on our kitchen sink and on the refrigerator. Is there anything else we should do for it? And I guess, like I said, with the last question, sort of answering what I was looking for, how would we know if we qualify to get any sort of assistance or refunds with the money that we've already paid? Like, will you guys notify us, or is it something that we just have to kind of keep our eyes open
on? Well, I guess, Jeff, if you want to take it, I just want to point out, because you asked, there's that handouts bar. It's near the questions bar. If you click on the PFAS resources and contact info, you'll see the link to the PFAS informational website and the web page, and you can find the sampling map there as well. So that'll give you a really direct link for the maps that Jeff was referring to. Jeff, did you have anything to add about his geographical area?
Yeah, you're probably in an area where it wouldn't hurt if you reach out to me directly, tomorrow via email, and I can run it to ground and look up exactly where your property is located and give you a definitive answer. That'd probably be the best way to find out where you are with respect to the consent decree.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. We'll definitely send you an email over in the morning then, or tomorrow at some point.
Okay, and then and then Lisa, I think, can help answer your questions regarding potential programs.
Right. So again, with the caveat that we don't yet have a program in place because we don't have the funding for it, but we're going to be applying for it.
Yeah.
We would try to make it retroactive for folks like you who have already, like you said, pulled the trigger and done something about it. We don't anticipate being able to reimburse everybody for the full amount of what they may have spent. Of course, with the pot of money, we have to do as much as we can. So we're thinking along the lines of it might come in somewhere around $500, a max of $500 or up to $500, but it's something. And we certainly don't have any information on what private homeowners have done. So we will put it out everywhere, on the town website, social media, get it in the newspapers, that sort of thing, if we're able to establish this sort of program. So just be on the lookout for that. I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't have a mechanism to notify individual homeowners. We have no idea what you may or may not have done.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
I guess if I can, maybe this isn't something for you guys, but sort of going off of that, I guess, has anybody ever approached like the town of Londonderry to think about doing like town water? And the only reason I ask that is my neighbor that's right behind me, there's like a small little development and they're all on town water. And the only way to get to their house is literally at the corner of the street where I live. So it's like all these people behind me are attached to town water and perfectly fine. And I'm the first house on the road and I have a well and I'm double what the state is giving for mandate. So is that anything that you guys have talked to Londonderry about to say, hey, let's get everybody on town water? Because I know they're also putting in a 55 plus development on my road and they're also going to be on town water. So it's like a little strip of houses on my street have wells, but everybody else is on town water.
Go ahead, Lisa.
If I could, just from the town side perspective, yes, we are definitely having those conversations. That would involve feasibility studies for, the whole town, certain parts of town, that sort of thing. But that would be more of obviously a longer term solution. And so right now, this rebate program at least is meant to be a little stopgap measure, if you will, to get us to hopefully a longer term solution.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I definitely appreciate your guys' time tonight.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, and Brandon, and it's in the slide deck as well, posted a map of Londonderry that shows sort of these chunky lines that are associated with other water systems. And just to be clear, those aren't town managed water systems. They could be condo associations, manufactured home parks, a 55 plus development served by a community water system. So there are little pockets around the town that are on a regulated public water system, but we also know there is a significant amount of the population that are on private residential wells like yourself. All right, next we have Celia Calkins.
It looks like Celia might be self-muted.
There we go. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you for doing this tonight. I really appreciate it. And most of my questions have already been asked and answered. So nice job, neighbors. You've done a good job. In your experience, though, just real quickly, how quickly are the grants or other loans and rebates allocated?
Are you talking specifically towards the programs that I discussed, or Lisa?
Yeah, both of them. Actually, like if Lisa applies for that one for the town of Londonderry, how quickly would that, be allocated, and the other ones as well?
Okay, yep. So if the town of Londonderry applies, they are a special project. It's to address contamination. So The process would be getting on an agenda for the advisory commission, and we have spoken to the town about having a proposal ready for a mid-June meeting. If they are awarded the funds, it's a matter of weeks to get a memorandum of agreement in place that basically allocates that funding to the town of Londonderry. So our timeline is probably 2 months from the time we receive their proposal to when they have the funding. Londonderry's timeline might be a little bit different as they develop, the finer details of the program and start their outreach. And this is, I'm going to speak for Lisa. This is a very fresh idea that they're working on, but there would still be some time to roll out the program. And Lisa, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Right. I appreciate everything you said, Erin. This is new to us. We've never done this before, and so I can't give you a nailed down time frame. We'll work as hard as we can to get it going as fast as we can. It's going to involve some manpower, of course, if we do get a grant and then administer the rebate program. And so I haven't even nailed down the details yet with our finance department of how we would process the rebates and that sort of thing. So I guess if you take anything out of this, it would be if you really would like to do something sooner than later and are able to do so in your home, if it's a point of use system or something like that, then I would encourage you to go ahead and do it and be on the lookout for applying for a rebate to get some of that money back, rather than waiting on us to put it in place for you to do so.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and Celia, for the community water systems and the programs that we discussed, some of them are a quicker turnaround than the others. So the consolidation feasibility study program, which is that $10,000 grant for sort of a paper exercise and doing the engineering to assist a small community water system, that would be based on eligibility in an application, and really the time. Again, once approved, it would be about 2 months to get all the agreements in place and get the funding available for those water systems. So we do encourage, if these community water systems have an exceedance of an MCL, to reach out to us and start the process so that they can start their decision-making process before it goes on too long. And same with the other programs. Again, Amy's program, and Amy, you can feel free to jump in. There's a review process and an eligibility determination. So, it's not instantaneous. And we do just encourage reaching out to us directly so we can help you in any system, anybody listening on that path to get this in place and so that they can move forward. Amy, did you have anything to add? Amy Rousseau?
So one thing to know about the remediation loan fund, though, for timelines is my program is retroactive. So work could be in place now and started and ongoing, and you still could come in for the loan fund. So my program doesn't necessarily stop you from moving forward with anything that you would want to do, because there is that retroactive piece back to September 30th, 2019.
Wow. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Celia. Next, we have Kathleen Kilroy.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Kilroy from Londonderry. We were notified that our direct next door neighbor had been tested positive and their well was contaminated. So we actually have an appointment on the beginning of June for the state to come out and test our well, which we just actually dug. Because our original well went dry last year. So I own a small horse farm, and bottled water is probably not feasible for horses, just with the amount of work I think with carrying water. And I don't even know if bottled water would even be an option, or if they're not offering it to like livestock, or if they're only offering it for humans, the family dynamic. And I don't have access to the town water line. So what we ended up doing, basically as a panic, was we bought a water filtration system for our house. Are there any ongoing class action lawsuits or anything else like that. And I'm not that I'm sue happy or anything like that. And I'm not, you know, it's just a shame that this is happening. I've lived in Londonderry all my life, and I'm wildly frustrated and disappointed. Are there any other actions other than the grants or things like that? Because I've spent more than $500 on my water filtration system. It was upwards of almost $6,900, but my family is safe, my horses are safe, and so it's just a peace of mind. And at this point, it is what it is. But are there any other, you know, class action issues going on, or any other task force that are going on, not just with Londonderry, but maybe just with the state also?
Yeah, it looks like Mike, well.
Sure, yeah, so this is Mike Wimsatt. So we are generally aware that there may be some class action lawsuits or other lawsuits. Those are actions that the state is not involved in, and we couldn't advise you one way or another on that. But to answer your question, we're generally aware that they are out there.
Okay.
If I could chime in as well, I've only heard through the grapevine. I have no confirmation that there are certain groups of residents in Londonderry that may be looking into it as well. Again, as Mike said, the consent decree did not, you know, negotiate away your individual rights as a homeowner, if you will, to take any sort of action that may be warranted against St. Gobain. But the town is not involved in any litigation.
Okay, is there any talk of, you know, whether boundaries were established, whether you're east, west of high range? I'm very, very close to high range, and I'm going to have to probably defer to your map, which I just did. I had a little trouble with it, but I'm wondering, would the boundaries change over time? Because obviously with, you know, water, you know, running through you know, things would expand, I would say, over time, no?
Well, so it depends what if your question is, will the legal outer boundary that was drawn in the consent decree change? No, that would only change if the consent decree were able to be renegotiated. It's not a line that moves with data, if you will. If you're asking, will the area impacted by these contaminants change? Well, then yes, that certainly could change based on how groundwater moves and flows. I want to make sure I'm answering the question you actually asked.
Yeah, so, you know, so back in 2018, you know, it was at this set area. So obviously as water flows over time, you know, the whole town could be contaminated. And would you ever go back and renegotiate the 2018 consent agreement?
Yeah, I couldn't speak to that. As I said, if that were to happen, it would take both parties being willing to renegotiate. So I won't opine on whether that could or would happen or not, but right now there's no effort to renegotiate that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Next we have David Heath.
It looks like he is self-muted.
David, are you there?
He's there. He's still self-muted. So David, if you can find your little microphone on your dashboard, that it should be red with a line through it. If you click it, it should turn it to green, and you should be able to speak with us.
Oh. I guess David, if you want to enter your question into the question box, we can have Jim Martin or Amy read it out.
Oh, he's saying it's grayed out, so it looks like he can't unmute himself for whatever reason.
Okay.
I have him on the list twice though, so I don't know if he's on the phone and on the computer. So okay.
Yeah, so why don't we'll move on to Robert McFarland, and then David, if you want to enter your question in, then Amy will sort of signal and let us know, and she can read your question for you. So Robert McFarland.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. The new headset doesn't always seem to cooperate. So we know Dave's not home. Question, several. First, the water in vegetables and fruit-bearing trees, how will this impact fruits and vegetables? If you're using the tap water, in our house, we use our tap water to water the vegetables. Is that going to impact the vegetables, consuming the vegetables, consuming the fruits and the trees?
Okay. Jonathan, did you hear that question?
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat the question back, and if you can let me know if I got it right. You were a little muffled there. So you're asking if you use the water either from your home tap or from a spigot that has PFAS in it, if you use that to irrigate fruit or vegetables, does that cause a problem for the fruit or vegetables? Did I get that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So right now, there's a lot of research that's going on to understand that. Some PFAS can be taken up from the soil into plants and can go into their fruits. We actually see this with other chemicals all the time, so things like heavy metals or even just essential nutrients that are out in the environment. The problem with PFAS is it's poorly understood what causes one PFAS to be well absorbed over another. So for example, PFOA can be absorbed by some produce items, but other plants don't seem to absorb it very well. Sometimes this depends on the species of plant. Other times it depends on the soil that's present. And if the soil is interacting very well with the PFAS, then it won't go into the plant. At this time, we don't have the information to know that for New Hampshire produce or New Hampshire products. So it's hard for us to make an estimation of what the elevated risks are. We know that looking at some studies from areas that have higher levels of contamination, that crops can take these up somewhat, but plants are not as good as people at taking these up, especially long chain compounds like PFOA. But at this time, we still don't have a lot of information to know for sure what level is a risky level. There are some practices you can do to reduce risk. So things like using raised beds and also always just mixing up your diet so you're not eating the same thing repetitively. But at this time, we don't really have a solid number to provide on what's a cutoff point for use.
Okay, livestock. At this point, I'm looking at doing some aqua farming, specifically with fish. And so I'm kind of curious, have any studies been done with things of that nature?
So with fish, and if you're talking about aquaculture and aqua farming of fish, so larger predatory fish like trout have been studied. Chemicals like PFOA don't tend to absorb very well into fish, or fish are able to eliminate them. But other PFAS like PFOS and PFHXS are well absorbed and retained by certain fish species. Again, we don't have studies on all animals or all wildlife, so it's hard to predict if one fish species is more sensitive than another. But it really depends on the conditions that they're grown in and what else they're eating. So at this point, we don't have a guidance number. That would be similar to a surface water standard if our agency had one. But at this time, neither we or the EPA has a surface water standard or water concentration to protect fish or fish for human consumption.
Cool. Am I out of time, or do I have time for one more question?
I think you have time for one more question.
Yeah.
The water delivery. So I contacted the Monadnock region folks today. We just got our results back today. And I don't know if they're overstressed or what the problem is. I can't seem to get signed up. And I don't know if they're limited on staff or what the story is. I don't know if this is the right forum to say, hey, what's going on here, you know?
Mike.
I'm trying to get the water delivery started at this point.
Yep, I think Jeff Martz can offer some information, or Mike Wimsatt. Jeff?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're trying to sign up with bottled water through St. Gobain and you're having some issues, why don't you reach out to me directly, and yeah, I can talk to you about what you're experiencing with that.
Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Robert. Next we have Mike Speltz, but I guess before we go to Mike, did David Heath ever write in a question?
He did, but I feel like he might have gotten out and gotten back in. So I'm going to unmute you again, David, and if you can try to unmute yourself and see if we can ask, and if not, I'll ask for you.
All right, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. And first of all, thank you for this presentation. It's been very helpful. And thanks for putting all this together. But one question I did have is I'm looking at getting a POE system. So that's the very large filters, 48, 52-inch tall filters. And at some point, they're going to have to be disposed of. At that point, presumably, they'll be full of PFOA or PFAS or some of these chemicals. Is that going to then be considered some kind of hazardous waste? And would that become a problem in terms of just finding a way to get rid of it?
Brandon or Amy Russo?
So at this time, there would be no prohibition against disposing of the filter media in a landfill. And so, landfills in the state at this time are lined, and so you would capture any leachate. And there's a whole list of things we have to do to address PFAS still. There's a number of consumer products, things like that have PFAS, and so right now we're really working on eliminating exposure in drinking water, but landfill disposal is an option right now. I will say a number of the vendors are working on alternative options, the carbon manufacturers or incineration. So those are also options right now. But things will evolve. There's a long list of challenges with PFAS, and we're just at the beginning of the list addressing the drinking water at this time.
Okay, so it sounds like by the time this thing needs to be replaced, there'll probably be more responsible ways of doing it than simply throwing it into the landfill. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, we have Mike Speltz.
Hi, thank you for taking the call, and thank you for all your time this evening. I know it's getting late. I'm wondering about the synergies that might exist between the DES effort to deal with PFAS and the other problems that we have here in Londonderry, probably arsenic being the head of a longer list. So as you go out and collect water quality data, or as people volunteer to send it to you from work that they've contracted for themselves, are you capturing information on other contaminants, and are we able then to somehow use that? It seems to me if we're going to make a decision between a large public or community water system and point of entry or point of use solutions, knowing that we're getting this other bycatch, solving these other problems, it would be very helpful information.
Yeah, I guess, Brandon, do you want to talk about that first? And Mike looks like he's got a response as well. Mike, do you want to go first?
Brandon can go first if he wants to.
So when DES is sampling, we're certainly sampling for PFAS at no cost to the homeowners. But when the appointments are made, it's been a general practice of the sampling program to offer to the homeowner the option of having their homes tested for, the other analytes, the arsenics and uranium and things like that. And so some of that data may be available. We have a provision where we can access that data and map it. There's also a lot of work underway statewide addressing the natural contaminants of private wells, and it's increasing to really get at arsenic. And so I think between that, some studies from USGS, the public water system data, and we know portions of Londonderry have a radionuclide challenge. We can really paint a picture of what the water quality challenges are for both the small water systems and private well owners pretty effectively, I think. We could always add to that by doing more work in the future if that would enhance feasibility studies and considerations.
Yeah.
So
If I could also add, I'm really glad you used the word synergies, because I think that right now is really a very unique time. We know that, any community, at any given time has some consideration what they might want to do by way of expansion of public water within their community. We have a situation now where obviously St. Gobain has some responsibilities within Londonderry, and that's likely to involve significant expansion of drinking water infrastructure, which, while it may be confined to the area inside the outer boundary, the improvements that would need to be made to the overarching existing water system, many of those improvements might be outside the boundary. And so there may be some benefits to the extent that Londonderry wants to work on, and its residents want to work on further expansions outside the outer boundary of the consent decree. There's some benefits to doing that at the same time that St. Gobain is fulfilling its obligations inside. We also find ourselves at a time when there's an awful lot of talk about PFAS at the federal congressional level, and a lot of potential funding sources that are being bandied about right now. And also the monies that are associated with American Recovery Program. So there's an awful lot of things happening right now. You also live in a town, candidly, that is really leaning forward on this. They're very, Londonderry is showing itself to be a terrific partner with DES on trying to solve these issues. So I think that synergy is a great word to use, because I think there's a lot of opportunities here to, benefit from a lot of things that are happening at the same time, and certainly not the least of which, the extent you, as you've noted, as you extend public water systems, you don't just address the PFAS problem, you address, any other naturally occurring contaminant problems that you might have.
Mike, I just wanted to add that Londonderry is one of only a few towns that actually helps its residents on private wells by conducting periodic private well sampling programs. So because of Londonderry's proactive work, we would likely have more data for this town and other towns, because they've been paying for homeowner testing on an unlimited basis periodically.
So who would be the contact, the sort of data czar at DES that we would work with to take advantage of all this?
We could work through Jeff Martz or myself to work with our sampling program to get access to the data that we have in our databases.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Next we have Nicole.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Thanks so much for all of this information. I kept coming up with different questions and you kept answering them. So thank you very much. I do have a few questions. One, we got our well tested after we got the letter in March, and they were very fast in coming here and helping us with the testing. We weren't offered any other tests besides the PFAS and VOCs. And I wondered if maybe we were offered that and I just can't decode all of the numbers and what they really mean. Is there a way for us to send the test to someone there around your offices where you could really just give us a summary of the things we really need to look at in this report? I know that our PFOAs are above the limit and we are outside of the blue area. So we are actually talking to several places to get a whole water system put in our house. But if that system is the whole house system, I don't know if it's protecting against the arsenic and the other things that could potentially be in our water, which means we might have to switch to a different kind of system. So it would change our decision depending on if we have other things in our water that are on this test. So I guess, or that we didn't get tested for. So that's really my question. If there's a resource there, I can send the information to.
Yes, if you did not test for the other parameters, the natural contaminants, just go to the Be Well Informed site, New Hampshire Be Well Informed, and from there you can get a list of the things that the state recommends that you test for, and a list of labs, private labs, including some near Londonderry, as well as the state lab in Concord that can do the work for you. And yes, they will mail out the bottles to you with instructions on how to return it back to them, and get your results within a few weeks.
And who would be the best person to have her send? It sounds like, Nicole, you're looking for somebody to just look at your lab report and help interpret it for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if the DES collected the sample, I have access to the data, so I could take a look. If you reach out to me via email with your property address, I can look up and see what tests were performed on your well.
Sure. Thank you. And then another question I have has to do with the systems that get put on your house. So we're looking at a system that would be put on our house for the whole house. And then we were suggested to also get a reverse osmosis system for just the kitchen and the kitchen faucet and the refrigerator. Does anyone recommend doing both of those things, or is it too much that you're overdoing it? Or would you say that you would recommend something that's gonna really give you the best water? Or are we just getting a quote that's saying you're doing more than you really should be doing, and kind of spending money that we really don't need to spend?
Brandon?
We certainly provide assistance to homeowners that have questions about water treatment. So once we see your results, we can talk about treatment of the whole house and then point of use. I will say reverse osmosis, point of use reverse osmosis is a really strong step. It takes care of almost all the natural contaminants you'd be concerned about, as well as the PFAS. And it's relatively inexpensive to install and maintain, but then again, you have to have an extra tap on your kitchen sink, and it's and a dedicated faucet that you use whenever you make drinking water or you use water for cooking.
Okay, and then thank you. And my last question really has to do with St. Gobain, and if the state is the part that's really confusing, and I'm sure that other people are kind of upset about, is that this has come up in 2016 and the company has not been shut down, and they've not been they've been operating this whole time, not putting an air filtration system in place. And now we've got till July for them to put it into place, but they're still operating and still putting all this pollutants into the air. And I wondered who's holding them accountable, and why it took so long for them to have a filtration system, 5 years after they found that there's a problem. And I wondered if anybody really had some answers to that, and if the state's really being aggressive about it.
Yep, I think Kathy Beam from the Air Division can help with that question.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's an important one. Just to give you some idea of the time frame of what's been going on, the facility was in operation, as you know, through the 90s and the 2000 time frame. In 2005, 4 or 5 time frame, they did some stack testing and identified that they were emitting PFOA. We actually had on our regulatory list of air pollutants an ammonia salt version of PFOA. And why that was important is because that law allowed us to enter into a consent decree with them to reformulate and eliminate that, or reduce that significantly to the point where they were no longer causing an inhalation problem for the air standards. So that in essence reduced a lot of the PFOA emissions that were coming out at that time. We were not aware of the fact that the air emissions would then infiltrate into the groundwater, become a groundwater problem. That became an evolving understanding as we were testing the water and whatnot. It wasn't until 2018 that the state legislature passed a law that allowed air emissions that cause and contribute to a groundwater problem to be addressed through controls. And that particular law went into effect in September of 2018. We issued a letter to St. Gobain within weeks of that becoming effective, saying they were subject to it. And they had, according to that law, the way that the legislature wrote it, 6 months to apply for the controls and determine the controls that needed to be installed, and a year for that to be installed after the permit was issued. So yes, it has been 5 years since the water contamination issue was identified, but we've been following through with the schedule, and up until February when they failed to install the control equipment, everything had been following the schedule. They're now under a consent decree with us to install by July of this year, along with some additional requirements that were imposed as a result of failing to meet that deadline. So we're hopeful that they will be up and running the controls very soon.
Okay, thanks for your help. And I do appreciate all of this information. It's a lot more than I could get on my own. And I'm sure everyone else feels the same way. I mean, I looked up a lot of different things, and really this is the most information I've received and the best presentation that I've seen of it. So I really do appreciate it. I'm seeing all these hearts at the bottom, so I think other people are also appreciating it too. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for your questions. Next we have Michael Yachts.
Hi, yes, good evening. Thank you for taking my question. A bit of background. I'm within the outer boundary of the descent decree. Probably one of the earlier properties to be tested, and ours came back with just for the PFOA alone of 42, which seems pretty high to me. And the bottled water has been great, but I do have an almost 2-year-old child, and who's getting a little bit more active at bath time, and every time he takes a big gulp of water, I just cringe. So I'm really thinking about putting in a broader filtration system, but it seems like the point of use won't necessarily cut it for the bathroom, especially if we keep expanding our family. So my first question, I guess, is it seems that the longer term solution within the outer boundary is to ultimately get infrastructure in place. That could take some time, understandably. Is there any idea of whether they would reimburse, or St. Gobain specifically reimburse any filtration systems? And then possibly could you speak to more of how to maybe remedy the bathroom in that case for younger children who don't necessarily follow everything that you might say or ask them to do? 'Cause I think I had heard the point of entry systems weren't as practical. So if you could please expand on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll start on that, Aaron, and there may be others who should weigh in. As far as what St. Gobain's responsible for inside the consent decree, if they're providing you with bottled water and they proceed apace to develop long-term solutions for alternate water, which may perhaps be connection to a public water system, then they generally would have satisfied their requirements under the consent decree from our perspective. As I said before, that consent decree doesn't affect your individual rights to take whatever action you feel you'd like to pursue, with the company, whether it be, asking them, engaging them, suing them, whatever it is you feel you would want or need to do. So I want to make sure that you understand the consent decree doesn't bind you. But in terms of the agency's treatment of St. Gobain, if they provide you with bottled water and then implement a permanent alternate water solution for you, then they will fulfill their responsibilities under the consent decree, and we wouldn't necessarily be in a position to ask them to do something further. So you went further than that, though. More important, your question is, what should you do to, I raised a lot of kids, and I understand about drinking bath water.
If it was just me and my wife, it'd be fine with the bottled water for years, and we could wait for the line to come in. But I do expect this longer term solution will take years. That's just how these things kind of go. And by that time, they'll probably be taking showers and it'll be fine. But it's bath time, and you just see him dive under the water sometimes and come up with his cheeks, puffed out, and I cringe. So we're gonna have to probably bite the bullet. I just don't know the best way of doing that, given it's not just a tap, like in the kitchen.
Right. Well, and John, I don't know if you could maybe comment on, relative exposure and that sort of thing in terms of the assumptions we make about consumption of water when we set these standards.
Yeah, so the standards are meant for like a regular drinking water source. What you're referring to with a kid doing that is incidental ingestion, where they're getting some smaller amount, although I recognize, depending on how many times they go under and keep coming up because they think it's hilarious.
Yeah.
So there is a thing of, for the amount that's there with you being around that 40 level, yes, it is higher than the standard, but from an incidental ingestion, that's not a huge risk. So it wouldn't really cause a great amount of alarm, but I also recognize, if the kid's doing it over and over again, then after a while it does add up to be a certain amount of water. But again, the standard's more meant for very long time exposure, using that as the main drinking water source. So, you start thinking about how many bottles or juices or other things that your kid's having throughout the day relative to how much they're getting from that bath water. It's a smaller portion, but understandably, it's still concerning because, they're getting that and it's not something that you would be getting them as regular drinking water.
No, that's reassuring. Thank you, doctor. But is it still that the point of entry systems are just, did I hear earlier correctly that the point of use is far better or more practical than point of entry because of the water waste that's created?
Yeah,
No,
Brandon jumped on. There you go.
I would say, you could remove all the PFAS in water for the whole house probably by putting point of entry for $4,000 to $8,000 for initial costs, and then some ongoing operation and maintenance cost. So it can be done and it can be done effectively. The challenge of point of entry is if you're going to try addressing all the other possible contaminants like arsenic or manganese or things like that. And at that point, it gets costly because you have to add other resin, other treatment media that costs a lot more than the carbon does for PFAS. And so you can be talking, $10,000, $20,000 if you have those things in your water. But it is very effective. You can remove PFAS from all the water in your house. It's just you have to employ other technology for the other contaminants. Point of use is definitely much cheaper. A reverse osmosis unit probably costs $800 to $1,200 to install and removes almost everything that you'd be worried about from your drinking water. So that was the point I was trying to make. But it is possible.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. So it's really just a cost comparison.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
One thing I would add, I think Brandon made a comment about how a whole house reverse osmosis system is not practical because, or maybe it was Amy who said, because it wastes a lot of water and it's just not a practical way to do a whole house.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking of, was the reverse osmosis, because it covers all the bases.
Yeah, we never advise that for whole house treatment.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And Michelle Lamoth.
It looks like Michelle is self-muted. Oh, there you go. You should be good.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, this is Michelle Lamoth from Londonderry. So I live in a condo association, one of the condo associations that has high PFAS. And so we have multiple buildings, multiple septic systems, multiple wells, and we've been discussing, what types of things, we can do for remediation. And I've got two different questions regarding this. One of the questions is, so we actually have small community water systems, plus we have private wells. So if we were to put the filters at the sinks on the buildings that have, in each unit, on the buildings that have the private wells, we've got anywhere from usually about five units per building that's going to be a reverse osmosis system, correct? The unit that's on the sink.
It could be carbon or reverse osmosis for point of use on the sink.
Okay, so if it is a reverse osmosis, my understanding is that for every gallon of water you get to use, you get to throw away 3 or 4 gallons. So my question is, when you multiply that by 5 units per building going into, first of all, the water coming out of one well and the water then going into septic, the same septic system, how is that going to affect both the well and the septic system? You're going to be taking out a whole lot more water from the well, and you're going to be dumping a whole lot more water into the septic system. Plus, what effect is there, you know, with the chemicals that you're filtering out that's going to go into the septic system? Is there any harm to either the septic system, or does it recontaminate the soil and then get back into the well water?
So you're absolutely correct. If you use reverse osmosis, for every gallon you produce, you could waste 2 to 5 gallons of water that goes to the wastewater stream for that, to produce that filtered water, 1 gallon of filtered water. But overall, in the water balance, it's really de minimis, because you're using a dedicated faucet to fill up cups of water, maybe a pot of water. You know, it ends up just being gallons a day, whereas all the water for laundry, dishwashing, sanitation purposes, you know, can be 90 to 100 gallons per person a day. And so, unless your well is already on the brink of failing, and that little bit of stress is going to cause it to, fail finally, it won't be an issue for most situations. Additionally, septic systems, it won't affect really the water balance of the septic system in a meaningful way. And you're right, the removed contaminants do go out with the wastewater and would go to the septic system, but you really wouldn't be changing anything from what you're doing now. As you use the water and it passes through your plumbing system and goes to the wastewater, the same amount of PFAS essentially is going there. And you're taking it from a well that's on site and putting it to a disposal site on site. And just so from a displacement contamination, it's all pretty localized. And the most important thing you're achieving is eliminating that exposure to drinking water, hopefully as a stopgap measure with this point of use for a limited period of time. So I think overall RO won't cause any of those problems to occur or increase the contamination issue. But I mean, your concepts are good, and those are all true. It's just the extent of the activity is not meaningful when you look at all the other water uses and what's happening now without treating your water.
Okay, that sounds logical. The other question I had was regarding the potential for the town to have some type of a rebate program. How would the association be able to apply for that rebate if they were to purchase the filters for each of the unit owners? Or does it have to be a private individual purchasing the system for each unit?
That would be a question for Lisa, and there she is.
Hi, that's a good question. Again, we have not yet nailed down any of the details related to this, but it is something that we'll take into account when we try to put together the framework for the grant application.
Okay, great, thank you. And thank you for this presentation. It's been very helpful.
Thanks, Michelle. And we have Jeremy Clubb.
Yes,
Jeremy, I think There you are.
Yeah, my question is in regards to the recent drought conditions and what effect they might be having on the actual levels of contamination that have been found in testing. You know, if I'm within the consent decree area and I've had my well tested during the drought and it came back as negative, but then if we ever do come out of the drought, you know, and more water is coming into the soil and getting in there, and then I'm tested positive again, and I test and it's positive again. So St. Gobain already fulfilled their obligations under the consent decree, and they wouldn't be required to provide any bottled water, any type of solution at that point in time because it already came back negative once, or, you know, what's the situation?
Yeah, that would Jeff Martz.
Yeah, thanks. So recognizing that St. Gobain is still engaged in this very large sampling endeavor and that there are a number of wells that haven't been sampled for the first time, the focus on the sampling is to address wells that have not yet been sampled. That being said, at St. Gobain has begun resampling wells that tested close to the standard. But to get to your question about the drought, we have a very limited data set of water samples that were collected from a small number of wells, something like 9 or 10 wells that have had water samples collected periodically over a 4-year period. And there is some evidence to suggest that during dry periods, the concentration of PFOA is lower than it is in an individual well if it's sampled during a wetter period or times when the water levels are higher in the aquifer. So in terms of once a site is a contaminated site has been investigated and we move into a phase where they're required to establish a groundwater management zone. Mike talked about GMZs early on in the evening. There's usually ongoing monitoring for houses that may have tested below the standard. And I would expect, you know, some of the wells are going to be resampled over time, but we're not at the stage of doing that on a widespread basis right now. But I will add, St. Gobain has begun sampling a limited number of wells in Londonderry on an ongoing basis. We literally just received a proposal for that work in the last several days. And that's part of, to add to the data set that I referred to of those handful of wells that have been sampled several times.
So if I have an independent test that comes back positive after St. Gobain's test came back negative, would St. Gobain have any obligation under the consent decree, or have they already met it?
No, they would be responsible for addressing your well if it comes back above standard.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jeremy. Well, I guess we'll just give it another moment because we don't have any other questions or any other attendees in our queue for the question and answer session. But amazing, you know, great questions from everybody. We appreciate this conversation tonight. And I will hand it over to Mike Wimsatt while we're waiting to see if anything else comes in, and Mike Wimsatt can close with a couple of words. And then Lisa, if you wanted to say anything, or Tom, please let me know and just come on camera.
Thank you, Erin. So this has really been an engaging session. I want to thank the town of Londonderry and certainly all of our staff who worked so hard to pull this together, but also all of you who really have, you know, you really gave us your attention. You've been hanging in there we're coming on 3.5 hours now. And we really are pleased and honored to be able to come and answer questions and present this for you. So this is just a kind of a point in time where we're giving you an update. We continue to work hard every day on this, and we'll continue to do that until we get to these ultimate solutions that we've been describing. So I would encourage you to you know, stay in touch with your town officials who are doing a great job on this. To stay in touch with us, you've got the contact information for, I think, all of us here. And if you have further follow-up questions or concerns moving forward, we would always encourage you to reach out to us. And again, thank you for hanging in there for a long session here. And we're very pleased to and appreciative the town of Londonderry made it possible for us to do this.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa or Tom, or both.
Let me start by saying thank you so much. You guys, you know, it's after 10 o'clock at night, and I know you guys have families and other commitments, and your dedication to this business and your craft, the expertise you demonstrate in your craft is just extraordinary. And on behalf of Londonderry, I'd like to say thank you so much. I know that this is going to be a continued effort, and we are looking under, as Lisa intimated, we're looking under every bush and every rock for any penny we can find to help our residents mitigate the cost and the expense of what they're about to face. And we really appreciate you guys being the technical arm to help us make good decisions for our people here in Londonderry. So I'll let Lisa close on behalf of Londonderry, but on behalf of the town council, thank you so much.
I don't have much to add. I did also wanted to echo my thanks to the folks at DES, not only for this presentation, but for being so helpful along the way. And let the folks that have hung in with us here to the end know just to continue to keep an eye on the website, social media, the newspapers, that sort of thing. That's how we'll get the information out to you as best we can with regard to any sort of programs we're able to put into place.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh,
sorry, my phone just went off.
Well, with that, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll be ending the webinar. And you will receive an email within the next day or so directing you to where you can find all of these links, as well as Lisa will have all this information, I imagine, will be up on the PFAS Task Force website.
Yes.
Bob, did you want to say anything? I see your camera on. Oh, there he goes. All right, and with that, have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.